Hey guys, tonight we begin our tranquil stroll through the flickering gaslit streets of 18th century London, following one humble lamplighter on his nightly rounds. Picture the soft glow of each lantern, the hushed cobblestones, and the gentle rhythm of wooden ladders echoing with every step. If you enjoy this slow burn history session, consider liking and subscribing, but only if it feels right, and don't forget to share your hometown and local time in the comments below. I love knowing where you're tuning in from around the globe. Now, dim your lights, switch on a quiet fan, and settle into your coziest spot. Let the world outside soften as we prepare to drift into a soothing past. We're about to begin a calm journey through time, one lamplight at a time. Now the story begins. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and focus on the tale. Soon you will drift into restful slumber. The screen now fades to darkness. Before the first glimmer of dawn, the lamp house stood in hushed anticipation. A low-ceilinged room of roughly hewn oak beams and whitewashed walls, it smelled faintly of tallow, old oil, and the lingering chill of the night past. Along one wall, narrow shelves bore rows of earthenware jars filled with whale oil, their thick necks still faintly stained by drips from yesterday's labors. A single raftered window, its panes clouded with moisture, let in only the palest hint of gray sky. In the shadowy corner, a small brass candlestick held a tallow candle whose flame shivered with each breath of air that crept beneath the heavy door. It was by this wavering light that our lamplighter began his day, silent, methodical, alert to every creak of timber and distant echo of church bells winding down their nocturnal vigil. He approached the workbench, where his tools lay ready. The long, slender snuffer pole, its shaft of polished ash wood smooth to the touch, rested beside a stout ladder folded in elegant simplicity. At the pole's end was the hooked snuffer, a curved iron cap, blackened by years of exposure to flame and soot. With careful fingers, he lifted the snuffer from its peg, noting how the iron felt cool in his palm. Beside it lay spare snuffer caps, flints, and a small brush for clearing residual soot from glass panes. He picked up the brush, ran its bristles along the bench edge to clear stray dust, then returned it to its rightful hook. Each movement was deliberate, rehearsed countless times, as if the day's routine unfolded at the pace of a measured prayer. The candle's flame sputtered as he lit a second pillar candle, placing it before him so that shadows, once dancing, now settled into stillness. Its wick hissed softly, offering enough light to see the fine grain of the ash pole and the soft gleam of brass fittings on the snuffer. He bent to the low hearth and fed a handful of kindling to the pale embers, coaxing a brighter glow to chase back the lingering darkness. As the hearth brightened, he could almost make out the ladder's joints and the shapes of oil flasks on the shelves, each reserved for later use, when he would refill his satchel for the morning's labors. Drawing on a small cloth, he wiped the snuffer's cap, removing any charred remnants. He lifted a glass flask, corked its mouth, and checked the thick consistency of the whale oil within. It sloshed quietly as he tilted the vessel, thick and honey-tinted in the candlelight. This oil burned more cleanly and brightly than tallow, a luxury for those who cared that their streets would not emit rank, acrid smoke. He tested the cork's seal with a gentle tug, ensuring no precious oil would leak on his rounds. Finally satisfied, he placed the flask into a leather satchel, its strap already slung across one shoulder. Everything found its place: snuffer pole, spare glass panels, flints, soft cloths for polishing glass. In his mind, the inventory ran like a litany. Slipping on a woolen cloak dampened by the night's lingering moisture, he stepped outside. The hush of the pre-dawn city wrapped itself around him. Each breath exhaled a small plume of warmth into the cool air. Beneath his boots, cobblestones gleamed with dew, slick but forgiving. Tiny droplets clung to the cloak's hem and his boots' edges, catching the candlelight as he passed nearby iron lanterns still lit by yesterday's last watch. Above him, the sky remained a deep indigo, gradually lightening toward the eastern horizon. The city's shadows were long and somber, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next stir of life. His first task lay just 20 yards from the lamp house, a slender wrought iron post supporting a glass-encased lantern, its wick still softly smoldering. He positioned the snuffer's hook beneath the iron collar that held the lamp aloft and lifted gently. The lantern swayed once, creaking on its hinge. In that suspended moment, he could hear everything, the distant toll of St. Paul's bells, sounding an hour that none could read in the dark, the soft rustle of shutters settling on windows, a dog's bark echoing from a distant courtyard. He tipped the snuffer cap over the lamp's chimney, and the wick below hissed as flame met metal barrier. A thin wisp of smoke curled upward, then faded into the night. He repeated the process at each lamp, moving in careful rhythm, hook, lift, snuff, lower. Some lamps stood only a stone's throw apart, others required threading between narrow alleys and past shuttered shops whose signs swung listlessly in the faint breeze. At each stop, he paused a moment longer to listen. The city at this hour was a living tapestry of subtle sounds, the flap of a moth's wings against a lantern's glass, the faint drip of water from gutter to cobblestone, the measured footfalls of a distant guard on patrol. Once, a cartwheel creaked as it settled to rest in a dark alley. Another time, a door within a shuttered dwelling groaned as if recalling its day's use. In these pauses, the lamplighter found a calm that neither daylight nor bustling crowds could ever offer. One lamp, near a warehouse by the river, demanded a slow twist of the snuffer cap to seat it properly before snuffing the wick. He pressed his ear to the glass and caught the faint echo of water lapping against the quay below. A loose pane rattled slightly against its frame. He reached out, tamped it gently with his gloved thumb, and restored order to the lantern's form. Such small details were as important as extinguishing the flame itself. A chipped pane could allow damp air to mingle with oil vapors and create sooty residue that marred the glass, dulling the lamp's glow for the next evening. With his round nearly complete, he found himself at the far end of a narrow lane where only one lantern remained. The wick burned low, sputtering against the current of cold air slipping between buildings. There, he lingered longer, watching how the flame danced within its small glass prison. Here and there, the glow illuminated patches of ivy climbing the brickwork and a stray cat crouched at the threshold of a doorway. When he finally lowered the snuffer, a final curl of smoke drifted into the morning air, and with it, the last glow of yesterday's light vanished. Re-entering the lamp house, he closed the door behind him, bringing with it a rush of damp air that stilled the candle's flame. By hearthlight, he set the snuffer pole into its rack, hung his cloak upon a wooden peg, and placed the last of his empty flasks upon the table. The workshop, once stark in darkness, now felt intimate and familiar. He crouched before the hearth, coaxed the embers to life again, and sat upon a low stool, allowing his shoulders to relax. Outside, church bells chimed the hour of dawn, somewhere between 4 and 5, though no hour mattered in that quiet hour of transition. As the city began to stir, he felt both a sense of completion and quiet anticipation for the day's forthcoming labors. Thus ended his first round of the morning, a ritual of extinguishment, a gentle farewell to the night's remaining embers. The city, freed at last from the hold of previous darkness, would soon awaken to traders, carriage wheels, and hastening feet. But for a brief moment, within the lamp house's warm glow, the lamplighter savored the hush he alone presided over, a solitary guardian of the threshold between night and day. And as the pale light of dawn crept through the window's misted glass, he rose once more, ready to prepare his tools for the next phase of his silent, indispensable pilgrimage through the streets of 18th-century London. He steps through the low door of the workshop before the sun has fully claimed the sky, closing behind him with a faint click that punctuates the hush. A single pane of glass in the north-facing window bears the pale dawn light, soft enough to illuminate his rough-hewn workbench without banishing the comforting half-shadows. The air is cool, touched with the lingering dampness of dewy streets, yet inside it carries the sweet, oily scent of whale blubber and the faint tang of cold metal. Here, in this narrow room, the lamplighter's day truly begins, a careful assembly of tools and provisions that will carry him from these silent walls into the restless city beyond. On one end of the bench, a row of empty glass flasks stands like silent sentinels, their necks wide enough to accommodate the thick, golden oil that will feed 100 lanterns. He reaches for the heavy earthenware jug of freshly rendered whale oil, its stopper eased free with a gentle twist. The lamplighter tilts it slightly, allowing a steady ribbon of viscous liquid to flow into a small pewter measure. The oil moves slowly, candlelight glinting through its amber depths, each drop reminding him of the long voyages and vast oceans that yielded this precious fuel. He measures with practiced care, 2 finger widths from the brim, before tipping the jug back and wiping its lip with a rag worn threadbare at the edges. Bringing the pewter measure to the edge of the bench, he positions the first empty flask beneath it. A fine tremor in his hands is only from the cool air. Years of steady work have tempered any unwelcome shakes. The oil traces a steady curve inside the glass, coating the interior walls with its glossy sheen. When the flask is 3/4 full, he sets the measure aside and lifts the cork stopper that waits on a small tray. Seating it firmly, he lets out a quiet breath and gives the neck a gentle twist to ensure a snug seal. One down, perhaps a dozen to go before the morning can truly begin. He steps back and moves to a battered leather satchel hanging from a peg. Inside, slender paper packets lie in neat rows, bundles of spare wicks, each trimmed to size and soaked briefly in oil so they will burn at an even pace. He removes one packet and fans the papers open, inspecting the soft cotton fibers for any stray pieces or uneven ends. Satisfied, he returns the bundle to its place and reaches for the next, a small tin box filled with flints, chipped sharp so that each spark will ignite the wick without fuss. He shakes the box lightly, listening to the dry rattle of stone against stone, counting them by sound until he is certain there are at least 20 good strikes awaiting him. The lamplighter moves to the opposite wall where a settling of shelves holds spare lantern panes, squares of thick, curved glass that catch the earliest light and fracture it into faint rainbows. Each pane bears its own slight imperfections, a bubble here, a faint ripple there, enough to make him inspect it carefully before tucking it into its padded slot. Should a pane shatter upon impact with ladder or snuffer, he must have replacements close at hand. He lays each panel flat, sliding a finger along the edge to feel for chips. Even the smallest crack is cause for the lantern to waver in the wind, and his pride will not permit a substandard glass to carry a flame into the night. With oil, wicks, flints, and glass in order, his attention turns to the ladder, a folding contraption of oiled pine and wrought iron stays. He unfolds it with a gentle creak, then listens closely as he rubs a drop of oil into each wooden joint. The plankings slide with fluid ease under his hand, joints moving on a thin film of lubrication that will help him perch high above the cobbles without a stumble. He tests each hinge, flexing the ladder as if it were already propped beneath a lamppost, noting any squeak or hesitation. Here and there, a small ring of rust calls for a touch of rag and oil. He attends to each imperfection until the entire frame sings a dull, contented whisper when flexed. A small table beside the bench holds pieces of his everyday gear, the snuffer with its hooked end, the brass-capped tinderbox, the ledger for tallying lamps, and a simple wooden handle engraved with his initials where the tools find their familiar home. He lifts each item in turn, feeling their reassuring weight. The snuffer's cap fits squarely over the wick when tested, the tinderbox flint is sharp, the steel brisk under a swipe. He snaps his fingers once and the spark flies, just as it must beneath the lantern's glass walls once dusk returns. He greases the hinge of the tinderbox's lid, closing it until he hears the muted thud of well-oiled metal. At last, he settles on a narrow stool and pulls forward a small notebook, its pages edged in ink where months of entries have left their mark. He opens to today's date and, in careful handwriting that trembles only slightly, records the count of full oil flasks, 13, to be exact. He notes the number of spare wicks, 7 bundles, and the flints, 23, yet one more than yesterday, a luxury allowed when time and calm permit the extra chipping. He writes of ladder maintenance, a quick entry, joints oiled, hinges freed. Each line is a promise to himself that no lamp will be overlooked, no fixture left wanting when he steps back into the streets. He closes the notebook with a soft sigh. Dawn light, now a slender beam upon the floorboards, shifts ever so slowly through the window. It reveals a fine scattering of wood shavings and a single drop of oil glimmering where he set down his pewter measure. The lamplighter rises, slipping his fingers around the leather handle of his satchel and slinging it over his shoulder. The ladder, folded and light, rests against the wall, ready for its familiar arc into the city's gloom. On the bench, the line of glass flasks glows faintly in the new day, vessels of potential brightness waiting to banish the darkness once more. He stands for a heartbeat longer, breathing in the mingled scents of whale oil and oiled wood. He feels the solidity of purpose in his chest, that each lamp he tends is a beacon for travelers, a guardian of safety in winding alleys, a comfort for those who stir in the hours before dawn. With a subtle nod toward the narrow window and the silent street beyond, he picks up his snuffer pole and steps toward the door. As the workshop door clicks shut behind him, he carries with him the quiet satisfaction of a task begun with care. The tools are assembled, the oil is measured, and the ladder is free of concession to age or rust. All that remains is to set forth, to climb beneath the still dark sky, and to kindle anew the city's light, one lamp at a time. The wooden door of the lamp house creaked softly as he pushed it closed behind him, shutting out the hushed lamplighter's workshop where the morning's preparations lay neatly arranged, the flasks of fresh whale oil standing sentinel on a low shelf, coils of spare wick, each thread soaked and trimmed, the folded ladder strapped with leather thongs, the polished snuffer pole leaning against the wall. He paused for a heartbeat in that dim interior, letting the last glow of the single lamp at his elbow fade. Then he drew a steady breath, squared his shoulders, and stepped into the street. A thin veil of mist drifted among the gateposts and the shuttered windows of Claymore Lane, clinging to the rough-hewn cobbles underfoot. He pulled the heavy wool cloak tighter about his chest, the coarse fabric whispering against his jerkin. The chill settled deep into his bones, an old acquaintance at this hour, and he welcomed it. In the pre-dawn hush, each breath came out in little puffs of white. As he walked, the hem of his cloak brushed the damp stones, absorbing small beads of dew that would later streak the wool with tiny rivulets. The smell of damp earth, of cold stone, and of wood smoke drifting from distant chimneys mingled in the still air, anchoring him in the quiet world before daybreak. He moved with deliberate care, for the morning streets were treacherous underfoot. A sudden misstep on a hidden puddle could send him sprawling, pole and oil bottles clattering across the stones. At each careful footfall, the laces of his sturdy boots whispered against the wet surface, seeking purchase on the slick cobbles. In the hush, this soft sound seemed as loud as a bell, recalling the distant peal of St. Giles' Church, already marking the hour in measured tolls. Slowly, methodically, he made his way toward the first row of lanterns. On either side of the narrow street, the ground floors of merchant houses lay shuttered tight. The wooden window shutters, dark with age and coated in the night's own grime, stood like closed eyelids over the city's slumbering eyes. He pictured the families behind them, warm hearths glowing faintly, children burrowed in straw mattresses, servants stirring at the hearth to see to the household's morning fire. The market stalls in Cornhill lay empty and forlorn, their awnings rolled down, frames rigid and skeletal in the dim light. He passed one stall of coarse linens, its cloth wrapped around a post, still bearing the scent of last night's rain. A solitary cat slipped from one shadow into another, tail held straight, whiskers glinting in the thin light. He paused to watch the animal's silent progress, every sinew taut with cautious grace. The cat, much like these lamps he tended, moved with purpose through the gloom, a solitary sentinel under its own moonlit sky. The lamplighter allowed himself the quiet thought that he and this creature were kin this morning, each charged with vigilance at an hour when most souls lay surrendered to sleep. Fog pooled in the low spaces near the Thames, drifting inward along the merchant rows. He could smell the river's brackish breath mixed with coal smoke from the barges moored upriver. Here and there, the iron hoops of barrels showed through the mist, stacked in neat pyramids before shuttered warehouses. He remembered one bitter night last winter when he had lit each lamp by the water's edge, his breath frozen on his cloak, his fingers stiff against the wood of the snuffer pole. Back then, the city seemed vast, endless in its unlit stretches. Now, with each passing dawn, he felt as though he were reweaving the city's tapestry, line by lantern line. Reaching the first lamppost, he halted. The post rose from the curb like a dark stalwart figure, its wrought iron arm curving upward to hold the glass casing that sheltered the wick. Not yet lit from the night before, it stood empty, a hollow lantern waiting for the evening's flame. He placed his gloved hand on the cool metal surface, feeling faint ridges where old paint had been chipped away. He could almost hear the murmured prayers of apprentices long gone, sharing a wish for clear skies and calm winds when dawn broke. With a deliberate motion, he extracted the snuffer pole from under his cloak. The wood was worn smooth from years of handling, the iron cap gently rounded at the edge so as not to chip the lamp's glass. He raised the tool in a quiet arc, his fingertips brushing the join where wood met metal. In the half-light, the cap hovered inches below the lamp's frame. Before he could douse any flame, though there was none here to extinguish, he lowered the pole and let it rest against his shoulder. This was the moment he liked best, that breath between shadow and day, when the city had neither begun nor ended its chores. Everything stood still, and he was at the very center of the hush. He unwrapped a small leather satchel to check its contents: spare flints, a stub of beeswax, a folded scrap of paper bearing the day's route in familiar scrawl. His name was at the top of that list, Thomas Arbuthnot, followed by a numbered sequence of lantern posts, each marking a stepping stone through London's pre-dawn realm. He touched the paper gently, as though blessing the route for good fortune. Each lamppost, each flicker of flame, carried a promise of safety to the dwellers who would soon emerge. He liked to think that when the first baker came to wheel his dough-laden cart through Petticoat Lane, the lamps he had tended would shine steadfastly to guide him. A distant rooster crowed once, carried along the lanes in a single clarion cry. He let the sound echo in his bones, a sign that the watchers of the morning stood ready. The merchant's servant, sweeping his stoop, paused under a dark lantern and tipped his cap as the lamplighter passed. Thomas offered a small nod in return. Beyond them, he could hear the creak of a grocer's shutter, the hiss of coals in a kitchen hearth beginning to warp a copper kettle. The city was stirring, though still half in dreams. He drew another steady breath, tasting the chill on his tongue. Then, as he squared his stance, he felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle over his shoulders as surely as the cloak he wore. Each lamppost he would visit in the next hour stood like a silent guardian, waiting for his touch before yielding to the morning's light. It was his task to ensure that, come dusk, no flame would falter, but this dawn, his task was simply to stand between night and day, feeling the pulse of the city slow in these quiet moments. He glanced eastward, where the sky faintly brightened beyond the church steeples. Pale bands of light lay upon the horizon, soft as linen folds. Those pastel hues promised a new day of bustling markets, of clattering carts and shouting vendors, but for now they remained a distant promise. Here in the pre-dawn world, he was the solitary keeper of the street lamp's vigil. He slipped his hand inside the pocket of his cloak and curled his fingers around a flint, an anchor, a small reassurance that the evening would come full circle. By the time he reached the end of this first block, the fog had begun to thin, retreating toward the river where barges lay rocking gently. He passed beneath a line of lampposts, dark sentinels all, and felt the pull of anticipation. Soon he would place the snuffer cap upon his pole, raise it to each lamp, and watch the tiny flame bow before the metal. But that moment lay ahead. Now, in these hushed steps, he savored the delicate balance between what had been and what must be. In this silence, every echo of his boots spoke of centuries of twilight watch, every puff of breath was a hymn to the unseen lamps poised in darkness. And so he walked on, cloak sweeping the stones, fog curling around his ankles, heart beating in quiet measure. Each step carried him deeper into the waking city, each moment edging him closer to the pulse of lantern light. Yet in these first steps into silence, he found a calm more profound than any flame, the calm of purpose held in the dawn's gentle embrace. A faint wash of pale light had just begun to soften the horizon when Thomas stepped from the shelter of the narrow alleyway into the yawning street. The eastern row of merchant shops stretched before him like a line of silent sentinels, each lantern poised atop its black iron post, glass panels clouded with soot from nights of burning whale oil. In the half-dark he could make out the low wooden shutters, tightly closed against the morning chill, and the soft hiss of dew evaporating from the cobbles underfoot. He unshouldered his ladder and adjusted the leather strap that held the brass-fitted pole and snuffer cap against his back. The weight of his tools was a familiar comfort, as steadfast as the routine he had followed these many seasons. He chose the lamp closest to the wide corner where the baker's shutters bore a wisp of flour dust. Setting his ladder against the wrought iron base, he tested the footing with a careful tap of his boot, feeling the fine tremor of stone beneath. Then, with measured grace, he began to ascend. Each rung was cold to the touch, and a thin layer of dew caused the wood grain to glisten. He placed his gloved hand on the wrought iron of the lantern itself, noting the faint warmth still clinging to the metal from the last night's flame. With deliberate care he positioned the snuffer cap over the wick. For a heartbeat the world seemed to grow still, the click of his glove against glass, the slow settling of his breath. Then came the familiar hiss as the hot wick met the cooler cap, a soft, staccato exhalation of flame giving up its vigil. Thomas paused at the top of the ladder for a moment, listening. The sigh of the extinguished wick lingered, an echo ringing from glass to cobble, and he inhaled the sharp tang of oil smoke mixed with the crisp aroma of morning air. At ground level below, the skein of mist hovered around the edges of the street, curling in from the river. He shifted his ladder to the next lamp, descending with the same deliberate care, tracing each rung with his fingers as though following Braille. Each post held its own story, some bespeaking years of faithful service, their ironwork worn smooth by countless hands, others newer, with sharper edges and brow-making still visible in the cast iron. For the third lamp in the row, he noticed that one of the glass panes bore a dark smear, evidence of a wick left too long, perhaps a moment's inattention on a windy night. When he climbed up, he carried a small cloth tucked into his belt, dampened with clear water from the workshop barrel. He unfolded it and, leaning forward, wiped gently at the soot. The glass glowed with an almost translucent clarity once the smear was removed, and in the fleeting reflection he glimpsed the bricked facade of the shop opposite, its name half legible in the weak dawn light. Setting the cloth aside, he returned the snuffer to its resting hook on the ladder, extinguished the wick, then brushed a fingertip along the ironwork to remove stray smudges of grime. By lamp 5, he had come to know the merchant whose nameplate read Fletcher and Sons. Morning's first rays crept across the sign, gilding each letter and casting long shadows behind the shuttered windows. Thomas left a small note, carefully folded and pinned to the base of the post, a single line in his spidery script, one pane cracked, repair needed. He would mend it later this day, after his mid-morning break. The ledger in his coat pocket ached for attention. Tonight he would copy these indentations into its pages, by lamplight, beneath the single lamp that stood sentinel in the lamp house. He paused beneath lamp 7 to take stock of the sky. A rose-tinged ribbon of light tacked itself along the horizon, and gull cries drifted up from the Thames, though he could not yet see the river from this vantage. The air was sharper now, as if stirred by invisible wings, and he drew his cloak tighter around his shoulders. His breaths marked puffs of steam in the still morning. In that moment of suspension, he felt the quiet weight of the city around him, cobblestones sleeping under dew, shutters locked against the cold, the low murmur of distant bells yet to toll the hour. Resuming his task, he climbed to lamp 8, the tallest of the series, its glass lantern perched high enough to require him to shift his ladder one rung deeper into the gutter. He tested its steadiness, then fixed his eyes on the wick. The faint glow within gave no more light now than the back of a smoldering coal. He adjusted the snuffer's position, mindful of the slight burn on the inner cap where each extinguished flame seared the metal. There was a brief protest, a reluctant hiss, and then gentle darkness. Descending, he caught the scrap of ledger paper protruding from his coat. With a slender lead pencil, he etched 4 simple marks, a cross for lamps doused, and 2 small circles marking those requiring glass cleaning or minor repair. He wrote swiftly but neatly, mindful of the pencil stub running thin against the rough surface of the leather binding. As he moved on, he counted each lamp in his head, 9, 10, 11, speaking the numbers softly so as not to disturb the hush that hung over the street. At lamp 12, a gust of pre-dawn wind rattled the overhanging shop sign, and the ladder quivered under his weight. He held his breath for an instant, then willed his legs steady, gripping each rung until the shutters ceased their chattering. The lantern's glass was so blackened that he almost missed the faintest glow still aglow on the wick. He snuffed it out, but the soot had baked onto the surface, resisting his cloth's gentle scrubs. He marked the ledger with another note: stubborn soot, needs heavier clean. Later, he would fit it with sand and water, perhaps even a trace of fine chalk to scour away the residue. Further along the row, he came upon a lamp whose hinged door hung ajar. The glass pane tilted like an uneven jaw, and oil had dripped onto the ironwork below. Thomas's breath caught as he climbed up to inspect. The wick lay half consumed at the base, unsnuffed and still warm. He pressed the door closed with a soft click, wiping the oozed oil with a scrap of rag. He noted in his mind to realign the hinge pin later, recalling the tightness needed to hold a pane securely against the drafts that often foxed lampposts. Replacing the snuffer, he extinguished the lingering ember, then ran a finger along the seam of glass, confirming the seal. By the time he reached the final lamp of the eastern row, the sky had taken on a soft, pearly glow. Each extinguished post now stood like a monument to the night's passing, silent guardians that once shone amber to guide travelers home. Thomas set his ladder aside, breathing out the last of his morning tension in a quiet exhale. He dipped his cloth into the little flask of water at his belt and gave the glass a final polish. With the lamp now cold and clean, he tucked the cloth back and produced a tiny slip of paper, his record for the day. He wondered whether the blacksmith around the corner would have time later to tighten the glass pane hinge he had noted. Or perhaps he would attend to it after refilling his oil flasks at the depot. He closed his ledger pocket, feeling the bulge of penciled notes. The eastern row was complete, 11 lamps had been doused, 3 of them marked for deeper cleaning, 1 for hinge repair. He stepped back to regard the line of posts, each one presently inert, awaiting the later hours when he would climb again to kindle their flames. The moment carried a gentle satisfaction, like finishing the final brushstroke of a painting laid out in ink and steel. Thomas gathered his ladder and pole, shoulders eased now that the first major task of the day was behind him. He stood for a final instant at the end of the row, listening to the city slip into full awakening, a distant cart's creaking wheel, the faint thrum of a street vendor preparing his stall, the clatter of shutters rising somewhere further east. Though light had begun to break, the lamps he had doused were still visible, dark silhouettes against the faint morning sky. Their glass panes, now cleaned, caught the dawn's first rays and glimmered like watchful eyes closing one chapter and poised for the next. He turned toward the bakery at the corner, the very first lamp he had tended. Already, the sign above its door reflected the earliest glow of day, and he could almost smell the yeasty warmth of fresh bread. With a final straightening of his coat, Thomas set off down the street, ladder and snuffer balanced on his shoulder, heading toward the workshop where he would refill flasks and note the repairs needed. The eastern row lay behind him, subdued and quiet, a silent promise of order restored until evening's vigil when flame would once again banish the dark. The eastern sky had barely begun to pale when he set out again, lantern kit slung on his shoulder, ladder folded against his back. A thin mist clung to the cobbles, and each breath he drew felt like a quiet agreement with the city's slow awakening. Beyond the thoroughfare of merchant shops lay a row of stately townhouses, their elegant facades still obscured by lingering darkness. As he passed beneath the first wrought iron archway, he became aware of the softest stirrings in each house he passed, a faint murmur, the gentle tug of window curtains, the rustle of fine linen in the gloom. It was in these moments he felt closest to the pulse of London's life. No longer was he simply a man extinguishing lamps, he was an early witness to the household rituals that would shape the day to come. He paused before a broad window framed by swags of velvet drape. There, behind the glass, the silhouette of a pale face hovered for an instant, as if curious about the stranger's progress. She was a servant, perhaps, rising to stoke the kitchen hearth, her hair was pinned back in a loose knot, and she pressed her hand to the cool pane, peering out at the mist. He offered a courteous nod, though he knew she could not see it in the dim light. He tipped his cap, and the flutter of curtains was his only reply. Further along the street, where the cobbles sloped toward a narrow yard, the faintest strains of a lullaby drifted downward. A woman's soft humming, carrying a tune of gentle refrain, came from a darkened room on the ground floor. He recognized the melody from his own childhood, a lullaby his mother once sang as he lay restless under the horsehair mattress. The sound was so intimate, so tender, that he lingered an extra breath before moving on. It seemed a sacrilege to extinguish the small oil lamp beside the window, for it was this very light that allowed the young child within to drift off in safety and warmth. Reluctantly, he drew close, fitted the snuffer cap over the wick, and pressed lightly. The flame guttered, then died, leaving only the thrum of the candle's tiny glow inside, no longer visible from the street. High up on the wall, an ornamental lantern hung by a wrought iron bracket, its glass panels cut into a pattern of ivy leaves. This one he loved to extinguish slowly, brushing away any last drop of oil, wiping soot from the leading edges of the panes so that when dusk returned, the lantern would glow evenly and without streak. With measured motions, he lifted his ladder, rested it against the moss-dark wall, and climbed with the care of a cat burglar. At the topmost rung, his fingers closed around the bracket, and he could feel the cool iron whisper against his gloves. His snuffer pole came into play, the brass cap descending gently until the last wisp of flame was gone. He pressed a fingertip to the glass, ensuring it was clean, then replaced the ladder at a scant angle that allowed the next passing walker to lean against it by mistake if they were unwary. The early risers he had glimpsed at each window were gone now, shuttering their homes and drawing blinds against the chill. The hush returned even more profound than before, as though the world itself had taken a single breath and held it. He counted the sleeping blocks in his mind, one row of narrow dwellings, for lamp posts bracketing each entrance, 2 yards crossing every 10 feet. He ticked them off silently, 7 posts before the corner, then 9 more leading toward the churchyard where the ancient yew trees stood guard over the dead. In that section, fewer souls remained awake to witness his labor, and the darkness seemed to rest heavily against the stone. He found himself thinking of the families who would soon pour from these houses, merchants hurrying to their counting houses, governesses shepherding young charges out to morning lessons, cooks carrying baskets of butcher's trimmings toward the hearth. He wondered which of those kitchens would be lit first by flame, and whether the milk would be warm in the copper pan on any given hearth. He felt, in these moments, that his task was more than snuffing flame, he was clearing the stage, preparing the city for its daily play. From the quiet streets, the market cries would soon emerge, footsteps would echo on the pavement, and the world of commerce and hurried errands would eclipse the fragile poetry of dawn. But for now, he remained the solitary figure in the entryway of a grand residence, pausing at a polished brass door knocker, marveling at its intricate design, 2 lions flanking a baroque shield. A single lantern post stood to the side, its slender shaft topped by a glass globe framed in black iron. He crouched, set his kit beside the base, and lifted the snuffer cap, easing out the last glow of the wick. A tiny hush accompanied it, a soft exhalation of oil cooling on glass. He ran a rag along the seam where soot had collected, smoothing each panel until it caught the faint morning light like a pale jewel. Dusk would find him rekindling this very lamp, ushering warmth back into the street, but at present he was content to press on. Beyond the townhouse, the street opened into a modest square, flanked by elms whose branches drooped in the half-light. No cottages there lay abandoned to shadow for long, each home was vital, each lamp a promise that the city beyond sleep would soon be awake. He mounted his ladder one last time to extinguish an iron-caged lantern set into the wall of the square's chapel. The hallowed silence within was palpable, as if the stones themselves had ears. Even the distant chiming of the bells, hours away from the first service, seemed to pause in solidarity with his work. When at last his rounds for this sector were complete, he descended with a gentle bounce of the knees and retrieved his ladder, folding it carefully against his shoulder. Only then did he release the held breath he had carried since his first step beneath the arch. The hush extended around him like a cathedral nave, and he welcomed its emptiness. He advanced toward the next block, where the sun's fingers would soon begin to gild the chimney pots. Ahead, the city stretched in quiet repose, awaiting the bustle of day. In his ledger, he would later note the time each section was darkened, the condition of each lamp bracket, and any households that stood still shrouded in sleep. But for this moment, this gentle interlude between night's retreat and day's advance, he was simply a silent shadow moving beneath rustling curtains, a keeper of the city's breath, a lone custodian of its unspoken dawn. And as he stepped around the corner into a new street, he carried with him the soft echo of lullabies and the tender promise that when evening returned, he would rekindle every lamp and once again banish the darkness. The lamplighter eased open the heavy door of the Sea Serpent Tavern, its oak frame dark with age and streaked by hands that lingered here each morning. He paused on the threshold, letting the muted glow of the low fire wash over him like a gentle wave. The air inside was warm, saturated with the sweet burn of malt and the tang of spilled ale. A small brass lamp, slung from a curved iron hook, cast dancing shadows across rough-hewn beams overhead. He closed the door softly behind him, muffling the faint echo of his clogs on the threshold's worn stone. Outside, the sky still held the pale promise of dawn, but here within, time felt slowed, as though the tavern breathed in deep before exhaling its mid-morning calm. He knelt to scrape soot from his boots on a coarse brush mat woven of hemp and colored by years of similar use. Bits of gravel and flecks of oil rose away with each firm stroke, and he watched them vanish into the bristles as though he were clearing away the burdens of the street itself. The smell of damp cobbles and the faintest hint of whale oil still clung to his wool cloak, but the hearth's warmth and the tavern's hush began to push these odors into the background of his mind. He stood and shrugged his cloak from his shoulders, folding it with care across the back of his wooden bench. At a narrow bench he settled opposite the hearth, its broad stones edged by a simple wrought iron grate. He drew closer so that his boots glowed red against the hearth's lip, and he peeled off a thin leather glove to stow it upon the bench beside him. The tavern's proprietor, a stout man with a carefully trimmed black beard and a cap pulled low over a furrowed brow, emerged from behind a rough-planked counter. He carried a small wooden trencher heaped with crusty bread and thick wedges of aged cheese. The lamplighter accepted the fare with a grateful nod, his fingertips brushing the cool lip of the trencher before drawing it more fully to his side. The bread was dense and slightly sour, but each bite was tempered by a slather of fresh butter the color of new dawn. The cheese bore a sharpness that lingered on the tongue like a memory of salt wind off the Thames. He ate methodically, pausing between chews to lift a dark tankard of ale to his lips. The liquid was pungent with hops, dark as a raven's wing, and it slid hotly down his throat. His eyes grew heavy for a moment, half closing as he savored the respite's small comforts. The soft crackle of the embers, the gentle thump of boots in the hearth's firelight, and the distant clink of mugs told him he was not alone, yet he felt cocooned in the tavern's quiet. Beyond him, through a narrow lattice window, the street stirred. A ragged beam of milky light traced across damp flagstones. He glimpsed the faint outline of a cart rattling by, the merchant's morning calls as muted as if someone spoke them behind a closed door. But here there was no haste, no urgency beyond the steady rhythm of hearth and breath. He closed his eyes, centering his thoughts on the next leg of his route. A scrap of parchment lay tucked next to his bench, its edges worn and stained with oil. There, in swift scrawled letters, he had mapped the cluster of lanes awaiting him beyond the western row, a labyrinth of narrow alleys where lanterns would soon need fresh oil and mended wicks. He reached out for a stub of charcoal and, by the firelight, began to mark notes upon the parchment, which lamps had run low, which wicks smoked more heavily than usual, and where glass panels bore fresh tracings of soot. His strokes were slow and deliberate, nearly meditative. In the hush of the tavern, he could almost hear the tiny sigh of each street lamp grumbling for upkeep. He imagined the clink of his ladder against iron collars, the hiss of flame as it leapt back to life under his snuffer, and he felt a quiet pleasure at the thought of bringing order and light to that tangle of shadowed lanes. The proprietor approached again, setting a small pewter plate before him. On it lay a handful of pickled onions and a slice of salt-cured pork rind. The lamplighter offered a faint smile of thanks, his eyes dim as he considered the brine on his tongue. Even this modest repast seemed luxury after hours spent in the chill hush of dawn. He paused from his writing to nibble the onions, their sharpness cutting through the dense sweetness of the ale, and chewed the pork rind until it yielded a subtle crunch. These flavors, stark and honest, reminded him of the simple rhythms that governed his own life: awaken, work, eat, plan, and repeat. Around him, the tavern's other patrons were scattered in small knots of conversation. Two laborers near the hearth exchanged murmurs about the morning tide and the state of the fish market. A solitary scholar, glasses drawn low on his nose, flipped through a slim leather-bound volume at a corner table, pausing every so often to sip thin tea from a handleless cup. They all inhabited this room for a momentary interval, drawn by its warmth, before scattering back into the streets. He watched them with gentle curiosity, wondering which routes they would soon traverse, which tasks they harbored for the day ahead. A low fire in the grate flickered and popped, sending sparks shimmering up into the rough-hewn beams. He set his tankard down beside the parchment and leaned back, hands clasped loosely around one knee. The warmth seeped through his cloak, through his woolen doublet, carrying away the chill of early rounds. His thoughts drifted through the hours yet to come, the repairs waiting back at the workshop, the fresh oil that would need to be measured, the fragile glass globes that might bear minute cracks requiring a heated glue. He welcomed each thought as a companion rather than a burden, for the lamplighter's work was humble yet honorable, a small bulwark of order against the sprawling city's encroaching gloom. Time passed with no jarring transition. He finished his bread and cheese, drained his tankard, and tucked the scrap of parchment safely within a folded corner of his leather satchel. Rising slowly, he stretched his shoulder blades, stiff from carrying oil flasks, and straightened his back. The hearth's glow dimmed as he stepped back toward the door, and the proprietor met him with a tentative nod. "Safe travels," he murmured, voice hushed so as not to disturb the tavern's serenity. The lamplighter inclined his head in reply, fingers brushing the brim of his felt hat. Outside, the world awaited with its damp lanes and silent sentinels. The mid-morning mist had lifted, revealing the pale blue sweep of sky. The air smelled faintly of coal smoke drifting from chimneys and of river water warmed by the sun. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, feeling the last eddies of tavern warmth depart as he shouldered his leather satchel and straightened his pole. The distant clang of a church bell broke the stillness, a clear, solitary tone marking the hour, and he set off down the street, boots steady upon cobblestones that glimmered in the gentle light. In that moment between rest and return, he felt a quiet certainty. The city might slumber or bustle, rain or shine, but his path was laid before him, winding through hidden alleys, beneath overhanging roofs, from lamp to lamp, ensuring each flame was tended and every corner brightened. With each step, he carried the memory of this brief sanctuary, a small hearth of calm in the middle of his day. And so, replenished by hearth and fare, he resumed his lantern rounds, ready to face the hours of work that remained. He pushed open the low, creaking door of the workshop and slipped inside, blinking against the glow of dusk filtering through a high, narrow window. The air was warm from the small fire in the spirit lamp at his bench, and smelled gently of coal smoke and the faint sharpness of whale oil. A wooden ladder leaned in one corner, its hinges still stiff with morning chill, and various poles and hooks were propped against the wall in tidy ranks. He set his pole upright by the door and hung his worn wool cloak on a peg, then removed his leather satchel, heavy now with one empty flask and two nearly spent ones, the ends of their stoppers flecked with oil. He sighed softly, lifting the lids and peering inside each flask, as though awaiting some sign that they still bore enough light for the evening's work. Before him lay the cracked lantern globe he had discovered late that morning, slumbering on a bed of soft shavings. A thin fissure ran its length, too narrow at first glance to admit a tool but wide enough to invite the wind's cruel bite. He set to work without haste. From a small shelf overhead he brought down a tin of shellac-based glue and, beside his spirit lamp, he trimmed the wick and lit the tiny blue flame. The lamp hissed lightly as it consumed its alcohol, sweet vapors curling upward. He placed the tin of glue upon a tripod above the lamp, holding a pair of long, slender tweezers to steady a small shard of glass he had cut to fill the larger crack. The glue softened, drooping like molten honey, and he drew it with the tweezers into the slit, filling the fault with patient, unhurried care. For several minutes he held the globe steady against the warmth, watching the glue penetrate the fissure and spread its filmy grip. The shop lay hushed around him, the muted tick of a pendulum clock on the wall, the distant rumble of a cart on cobbles outside, the measured crackle of the flame beneath the tin. He blew softly at the lamp, shifting the soot away from the glass, then set the repaired globe aside on a linen cloth to cool. Even as he worked, his mind wandered to the coming evening, when lanterns would glow in every alcove and corner, and this very globe would frame a gentle, amber light for some passerby's comfort. Next, his attention turned to a spare lantern body whose wick had frayed beyond use. He lifted it from the bench, its iron frame cold to the touch, and placed it on a wooden block. From a small drawer he drew out a coil of new cotton wick, its fibers crisp and white. With a pair of scissors he snipped a length slightly longer than the reservoir's height, mindful that a too short wick would sink below the oil's surface and a too long one would smolder excessively. He rolled the wick between calloused fingertips, guiding it through the wick holder, then pressed it into the small brass collar. A careful twist ensured the cotton settled into place, ready to draw oil upward by capillary action. He paused to test its tension by pulling gently. It moved freely, neither snug nor slack, and he nodded to himself, satisfied. He replaced the lantern on its stand and opened his leather satchel. The flasks inside rested on a bed of straw for cushioning, their stoppers marked in chalk with hour counts, 3, 2, 4, to note how long each had burned during the previous night's rounds. He removed the emptiest flask and held it to the light. Its interior was slick but almost bare. Then he lifted the next, its level dipping low, and tapped the side with a finger, listening to the hollow sound that told of oil's absence. At last he found the fullest flask, its dark liquid barely sloshing when he tilted it. He set that one aside for refilling after supper, and gathered the others for immediate attention. He laid them on the bench and produced a glass measure, pouring fresh, pale whale oil from a larger demijohn with a steady hand. The rich smell filled the air, a scent at once heady and sweet, and he watched as the viscous liquid filled each flask to a mark he had scratched in his memory. When each reached the proper level, he sealed them and returned them to the satchel, careful not to spill a single drop. With oil flasks replenished and repaired globe cooling, he turned to the iron bracket salvaged from yesterday's misadventure down near the docks. The bracket's arm had bent under the strain of wind and weight, its joint now loose and insecure. He tapped it lightly with a small mallet, listening to the dull ring of metal, then placed it upon the anvil at his forge. Though night had not yet fallen outside, he stoked the small fire with a bit of coal, coaxing flame until the metal glowed a dull red at the point of impact. He wrapped a length of iron wire around the joint and heated it until it conformed around the break, then hammered it gently to flatten and secure the reforged seam. Sparks flew like tiny fireflies before vanishing into the darkness. When the metal had cooled to a bearable warmth, he tapped the arm back into alignment, using a square block to judge the correct angle. A firm rap here, a gentle pressure there, and the bracket straightened once more, ready to cradle a lantern's weight on some windy thoroughfare. All this he performed with a calm deliberation, as though each action were part of a measured ritual. The workshop now bore the marks of his diligence. The globe stood restored, the spare lamp waited with its fresh wick, the flasks gleamed full, and the bracket lay true and firm. He straightened, rubbing the small ache from his shoulders, and surveyed his workbench by the light of the spirit lamp. Shadows flickered on the rough-hewn walls, and for a moment he allowed himself to imagine the lanterns alight under a velvet sky, their soft glow chasing away the dark corners of the city. The thought was often a comfort, as it would be to many when evening came. He reached for a scrap of parchment pinned to a nearby board, a tally of broken panes, worn-out wicks, and odd repairs. With a quill dipped in ink, he recorded today's mending, noting the globe's crack sealed at 3 inches and the bracket refitted at a 45-degree angle. He listed the number of flasks refilled and the length of wick consumed, his script neat and steady. These records, he reminded himself, guided tomorrow's preparations and prevented surprises when he resumed his route at dawn. When his ink had dried, he extinguished the spirit lamp by pinching the wick between thumb and forefinger, leaving only a settled warmth behind. He gathered his tools, tweezers, mallet, scissors, quill, and stowed them in drawers or hung them in their appointed places. The workshop door, as heavy as the one at the depot, creaked as he shut it, and beyond, pale evening light slipped across the cobbles. He hung his lantern and bracket, his lamp and snuffer pole, each in its spot, then retrieved his satchel, now brimming with fresh supplies. He donned his cloak once more and settled the satchel's strap securely across his chest. Pausing in the doorway, he inhaled the quiet approaching dusk, listening to the footsteps of a passerby on the other side of the street, the murmur of a distant carriage wheel, the rustle of leaves in a breath of wind. Within his satchel lay tomorrow's promise of light, within himself, a gentle certainty that his work, though humble, lent a measure of steadiness to the city's pulse. He closed the workshop door behind him and stepped back into the warm twilight, carrying with him the tools, the oil, the repaired glass and iron, each ready to shine against the coming night and to guide him on the next leg of his daily calling. He steps off the narrow towpath where he has rested his ladder and snuffer pole, the mid-morning sun warm upon his shoulders. All around him, the Thames glitters beneath a sky of pale blue, the river drifting slowly downstream as if reluctant to hurry. He finds a patch of firm ground between the low brick wall of the wharf and a weathered bollard, and there he pauses. With careful fingers, he unfastens the straps of his heavy woolen greatcoat and spreads it upon the rough timber of an old quay beam. The cloth is thick and folds stiffly, wool still scented faintly of sheep and lanolin, a comfort against constant damp. He smooths its surface, as though ironing out wrinkles, then kneels to examine every inch. First he turns the coat inside out, revealing a hidden pocket at the lining's lower seam. He slips in his hand, feeling for shards of broken glass or chips of lantern. On occasion, a shattered globe or loose sliver of pane may cling unseen in the folds of his garment, and he will not have a fragment scratch his cheek or pierce his fingers once the afternoon's work begins. He withdraws his hand slowly, brushes off a few specks of soot from the interior, and nods to himself. The coat is clear. With a gentle shake, he writes it once more and rolls it into a neat bundle, placing it beside his bag of spare wicks and fragments of cloth. His gaze drifts across the river. A string of barges lies moored to the piling up river, their prows painted in chipped green and red. A single barge drifts free of the tether, drifting lazily toward London Bridge. The rope trails, dipping its frayed end into the water's dark current. He watches the boat's slow progress, the sun flashing off its wooden planks like distant lanterns. Each barge carries coals or timber, cargo that glints with promise of fire or shelter. He imagines the blacksmiths who will use that coal tonight, the hearth fires kindled in Mews cottages far from the river's edge. He feels a kinship with those workers of flame, though his craft is gentler than the forge's roar. He lifts from his satchel a small scrap of coarse linen cloth, stained by whale oil and soot. In one pocket he finds a small, soft brush, horsehair bristles bound to a wooden handle. With patience born of long habit, he dips the brush into a shallow basin of clear water kept for this very purpose, before sweeping the bristles across the cloth. He wipes at the iron hook on his snuffer pole, turning it slowly until every ridge and groove gleams. In the bright noon light, the brass hook catches the sun and reflects a narrow arc of light onto the quay's planks. He leans forward to inspect each polished surface, running a finger along the metal's contours. There is no pitting, no sign of rust. Satisfied, he lifts the hook anew and watches, momentarily pleased by the soft arc of reflected radiance. Behind him, the air carries the cries of gulls wheeling above the water. Their plaintive calls echo off the low warehouses and the tall chimney stacks that rim the river's edge. Dockworkers shout to one another, voices carried on the breeze, "Bring the hemp. Fasten the tackle. Mind the belaying pin." He tilts his head to listen, the chatter of men and the creak of ropes forming a familiar undertone to his silent reveries. He closes his eyes for a moment, breathing in the mixed scents of salt, cold dust, and damp timber. Each aroma reminds him of his own day's passage, the bitter tang of whale oil in his nostrils, the faint sooty edge clinging to his gloves. A small boat, its hull painted a deep russet, glides into view. A pair of river men guide it alongside the wharf, pushing against the mud with long poles and grunting with effort. They tie up their craft, then clamber up onto the quay's edge, buckets in hand. He greets them with a nod and a slight lift of his cap. One of the men tips his hat in return. The brief exchange, wordless as it is, anchors him here, beside the river and this small moment of reprieve. He sets aside the brush and basin, reaching instead for a small wooden box of scented wax. The box is narrow, its cover fastened by a silver clasp. Inside lies a slender stick of beeswax, redolent of summer hives. He breaks off a small sliver and rolls it between his fingers, warming it to a glossy sheen. Then he rubs it over the hinges of his folding ladder, ensuring that each joint will open and close without protest this afternoon. The wax seeps into the metal, sealing out damp and softening the movement of iron upon iron. He runs his hands along each rung, checking for loose nails or splintered wood. Each rung feels firm, the ladder remains true. He breathes deeply and straightens. His boots press into creaking floorboards left wet from the tide's high drift. He glances toward the far bank, where a row of custom houses stands tall, their windows shuttered against prying eyes. Soon he must cross the river by ferry or by one of the low barges fitted for foot passengers. But not yet. Right now, in this still hour, the city seems to hold its breath. Noon, exactly marked by a distant toll of St. Paul's bells, a clear note that trembles across the water. He listens, 1, 2, 3 deep tones, then the thin ring of subsidiary chimes. He takes from his satchel a small leather-bound book, his personal ledger. He sits upon the quay's low edge and places the book in his lap. His quill, trimmed to a fine point, is ready at his side. In careful script he records the time of day, the number of lamps he has extinguished this morning, and the number awaiting his return. He marks the oil flasks that remain half full, tallying each fraction of a pint. He notes the new glass panel he will need to carry, the brass hook polished to a bright gleam. This ledger is his constant companion, mapping the progress of every hour from the first extinguishing at dawn to the final lighting at dusk. The river's gentle undulations rock the small ferry that plies back and forth between wharf and wharf. He considers boarding it now, to reach the section of docks where a broken bracket awaits attention. But he sets his ledger aside, standing to shake out his coat and strap it once more across his shoulders. He secures the leather satchel of wicks at his side, checks the alignment of the ladder foot upon the timber planks, and hefts his snuffer pole with a practiced motion. The river's breeze stirs his cloak. He inhales one last draught of the mingled scents, salt, oil, smelted iron, and steels himself for the work ahead. His gaze returns to the barges drifting slowly downriver, each carrying wood for hearth and coal for forge. He thinks of his own small service, kindling at dusk the lights that guide children home from play, lighting the way for coaches and carts as merchants close their shops. This midday inspection, these moments of quiet might seem idle to a passerby, but he knows their value. Every polished hook, every assured step upon a well-waxed ladder, every lamp unchecked but ready, these are the silent guardians of the city's safety. With a final steadying breath, he steps forward, lifting his ladder with deliberate care, and marches toward the ferry's waiting plank. The afternoon's work awaits. He had paused at the river's edge, beneath the weary gaze of shipping cranes and the languid drift of barges, when he first noticed the lamp bracket. It jutted from the aged stone wall of a narrow quay passage, its iron arm warped and bowed as though bowed by some unseen burden. The mid-morning sun glinted off its twisted curve, revealing a dozen small cracks near the base where it emerged from the masonry. Normally, his duty would lead him onward, lantern in hand, to inspect the lamps farther along the dockside. But this bracket lay at the very entrance to a cluster of lean-to warehouses, each doorway dark and waiting for the lantern's eventual glow. To pass it by would be to abandon a vital sentinel of the night. So he drew near, weighing his options. The bracket leaned outward at a cruel angle, its hook once meant to cradle a glass-framed lamp now sagging perilously toward the cobbles. A sudden gust of the river breeze rattled against nearby shutters, and he pictured the lantern glass falling, shattering, the oil streaming and staining the stones. London's nights were deeply dependent on these humble posts and lamps. A single broken bracket might leave a stretch of street in shadow, inviting mischief or worse. He knelt, rolling up the sleeve of his woolen coat to give his forearm more freedom. Under the smooth patina of soot and age, the iron was cold to the touch, yet warm where the heat of countless summer days had seeped into its body. He tapped lightly with the end of his snuffer pole and listened to the dull chime, a hollow, muted ring that confirmed his suspicion of fracture. He stood and dusted off his hands, glancing around for assistance. The riverbank remained nearly silent, save for the soft lap of water against aged timbers, the distant creak of a crane, and the occasional call of a gull skimming the surface. Across the way, a low-slung forge sent a lazy ribbon of smoke into the clear air, and he remembered the blacksmith who minded the place. He had passed the smith's shop earlier that morning, watching sparks arch beneath the hammer with a gentle fascination. Now, he shouldered his satchel of tools, wicket pliers, spare wicks, a small flask of oil, and his most trusted file, and made his way toward the glow of the hearth. Through a battered wooden door hung on iron hinges, he found the smith tending the coals. The forge's hearth burned with a warm orange heart, feeding tongues of flame into the darkened alcove. The blacksmith himself stood tall, his leather apron bearing a constellation of scorched patches and metal filings. At the sound of approaching footsteps, he paused mid-stroke and wiped sweat from his brow with the back of a sooty hand. "Good day," the lamplighter greeted softly, setting his ladder and snuffer pole against the wall. "There is a bracket yonder by the quay, bent and broken at its foot. Might I borrow your anvil and hammer a moment's time?" The smith gave a low nod, motioning him forward. "Aye, lad. That bit of iron's seen better days. Bring it here, and we'll coax it back into shape." He lifted a coil of heavy chain and handed one link to the lamplighter, securing it around a stout wooden beam. The bracket, once pried loose from the wall with careful jabs of the pry bar, swung from the chain like a pendulum of silent complaint. Setting the bracket upon the anvil cradle, the lamplighter went to work with the hammer, each blow deliberate and precise. The smith fed more coal to the fire, then plucked a pair of tongs to grasp the iron, turning it slowly so that every bent angle would face the heat in turn. A brief hiss rose as moisture in the metal's pores met the forge's warmth, yet the iron glowed a faint red only where the smith's tongs held it. The lamplighter examined the bracket's bow, marking the high points of distortion with chalk. Then, positioning the smooth side of the hammer face across the convex curve, he struck. The iron flared and shifted, obeying the subtle insistence of each tap. Once the curvature reached a gentle arc, more true to its former alignment, he slid it back under the tongs and quenched it in a pail of water, watching steam plume into the dimness. Together, blacksmith and lamplighter checked its integrity. The cracks that had threatened to split the bracket now lay closed, sealed by the smith's heated coaxing. A faint line remained at the site of the deepest fissure, but the iron stood firm under pressure. To be sure, the lamplighter lifted his full oil lamp, brimming nearly to the brim with whale oil, and suspended it from the hook. It bore the weight evenly, the bracket holding steadfast under load. He swayed the lamp gently, testing its balance, and the glass panes caught the firelight, throwing dancing shadows against the walls of the smithy. He exchanged a look with the blacksmith, silent accord passing between them. Gratitude filled his chest. He replaced the bracket onto its chain long enough to give it a final rub with a cloth smeared in oil, thus guarding against rust. The smith winked and gave a grunt of approval, returning to his bellows and hammer. The lamplighter gathered his tools and reclaimed his ladder. Outside again, the harbor air felt cooler, laced with the tang of salt and soot. He lifted the repaired bracket into place, sliding the base into the mortise cut in the stone. With two spade-headed screws from his satchel and a small iron wrench, he tightened them until the bracket stood rigid and true. He placed the lantern upon its hook and struck flint against steel. A brief shower of sparks arced across the wick, a small blue flame flickered, then settled into a steady golden glow. The light spread across the cobbles, illuminating the narrow passage where stacks of wooden crates lay piled. He brushed soot from the glass with a soft cloth, then stepped back and watched as the lamp cast a circle of reassurance in the half-light. At that moment, the lamplighter felt the weight of his responsibility more keenly than ever. This modest bracket, now restored, would stand for many nights to come, guiding dockworkers, late-returning sailors, and the occasional solitary wanderer. He imagined the glow reaching up into the fog should mist roll in, ordinary yet vital. The simple act of repair had linked his hands to the unseen labors of the city, blacksmiths forging, lantern boys climbing, merchants hurrying to close stalls before dusk. All these threads wove together into London's greater tapestry. Content that the bracket would endure, he gathered his ladder and snuffer pole. He paused at the lamp's edge, breathing in the hushed sigh of the Thames, the soft click of wooden wheels from a passing barge, the echoes of life carried on the breeze. He straightened his coat collar against the river chill and moved onward, the newly lit lamp receding behind him in a quiet swath of amber light. Ahead lay the next stretch of lamps, rows of iron arms, some stout and sure, others perhaps waiting to be mended. He stepped forward with measured care, knowing that beneath each functioning lantern lay the promise of safety, order, and the gentle steadiness of a lamplighter's hand. Thus, with the broken bracket reborn, he resumed his solitary journey through the docks, each step bringing him closer to the unlit street lamps that awaited his calm, unhurried touch. The sun, still high upon its arc, spilled down between the narrow facades of the marketplace, turning the cobblestones to warm honey and casting elongated shadows beneath wares and stalls. Our lamplighter paused at the edge of Pudding Lane, oil can in hand and ladder strapped across his shoulder, inhaling the mingled scents of corduroy cloth, fresh-cut timber, and the faint tang of dried fish hung from a nearby stall. The morning's labors, dousing old lamps and mending broken brackets, had given way now to the steady, deliberate work of cleaning and straightening the fittings that would soon carry light into the coming night. This was the afternoon vigil, a time to restore order to each lantern, to banish soot and misalignment, and to greet the merchants as they hawked their goods in the bustling lanes of 18th-century London. A wagon rattled past, its iron-rimmed wheels scattering grit. He set down his oil flask and unfolded the wooden ladder, its rungs worn smooth by many a climb. Atop a low bracket stood the first lantern, its glass panes speckled with grey film and the brass collar loose upon its iron arm. He rested one foot on the lowest rung, hands steady as he lifted the hinged door of the lantern. Inside, the wick and flame had long since been extinguished, now only the residue of smoke remained, clinging like fine soot to every corner of the glass. Patiently, he withdrew a clean, soft cloth, already damp with a solution of warm water and a drop of gentle soap, and began to wipe each pane in small, methodical circles. The friction loosened the sooty layer until the glass gleamed once more, clear enough to catch the reflection of passing strangers and the bright noon sky. Between swipes, he ran his fingertip along the edges, ensuring no grit had lodged in the crevice, then dried the panes with a second cloth, leaving no trace of moisture. Below, the fishmonger let out a hearty call to passers-by, extolling the freshness of cod and haddock. The lamplighter stepped down, offering a nod and a gentle, "good day," to the vendor, who tipped his hat in return before turning back to his customers. Each greeting was as practiced as the motions of his craft, respectful, low in tone, the briefest of exchanges that acknowledged the common life of the street. He retrieved from his satchel a small brace and bit, selecting a screw bit suited to the aged iron collar above. Returning to the ladder, he climbed again, inserted the bit into the head of a loose screw, and began to turn. The brace transmitted each click of metal threads, tightening until the collar sat snug against its bracket. With a final twist, he tested the lantern's alignment by gently tapping the iron arm. It remained steady. Satisfied, he replaced the bit and stepped down once more. The next few lampposts followed the same order, glass cleaned, screws tightened, the iron arm tested for secure hold. Yet even as his hands moved in measured repetition, his eyes roamed over the scene of the market around him. To his left, a woman draped bolts of pastel cloth over a makeshift counter, while beyond her, a boy chased a hoop along the stones, laughter echoing under the high roofs. A stall shaded by striped canvas sold apricots and cherries, their skins glistening with dew, an early treat for the wealthier patrons. Between the vendors, he caught sight of the abbey's tall spire, glinting in the afternoon light. Though his work was humble, he felt that he, too, formed a vital part of this living tapestry. Every lantern he restored would later guide the safe return of merchants, parishioners, and laborers to hearth and home. By the time he reached the corner of Eastcheap, the sun had shifted westward, and the heat lay heavy on the market. He paused to unstop his nostrils with a small dusting of fine flour, an old trick to clear away lingering soot, and took a sip of cool elderflower water from a leathern canteen. A fruiterer caught his eye and offered him a slice of sugared apple. He accepted it with thanks, observing the vendors as they measured sugar and chaffered with customers. The sweetness of the apple, tempered by the fruiter's careful sprinkling of fine sherry, revived his spirit for the next leg of his route. Resuming his vigil, he approached a group of lamps mounted upon a curved iron bar that jutted from the side of a long shop front. 3 lanterns hung in a row, each showing signs of strain. One's door hung slightly askew, another's collar bore a smear of hardened pitch, and the third's glass retained streaks of uprush and residue. He started again with the furthest lamp, extending his pole to open its clasp. Inside rested the wick tube and oil reservoir, now dry to the touch but for a few spots of grease. He wiped the door's hinge with a rag dipped in linseed oil, coaxing the metal back into smooth function. Then he took up his little scraper, just broad enough for the lantern's bottom rim, and carefully shaved away bits of old pitch that had oozed from the seams. The scrapings fell in minuscule flakes. Only then did he proceed to the panes themselves, buffing until each was free of all blemish. With that lantern complete, he tightened the collar on the middle lantern, using a miniature wrench carved by a blacksmith friend, its jaws held fast to the squared nut. The final lantern required more finesse. A screw, corroded by rain and mist, resisted the wrench. The lamplighter leaned in, steadying himself, and applied gentle pressure until the metal gave way. Sparks of formation, tiny bursts of oxidation, flew from the joint. He replaced the screw with a spare, carried for just such occasions, then tested the lantern's sway with a small push. It remained firm, ready to bear the weight of fresh oil and wick at eventide. Throughout these tasks, he observed the shifting currents of market life. A cart laden with hay rattled by, he stepped aside, brushing a stray straw from his shoulder. A group of children chased one another around the lampstand, squealing in delight as they dodged the merchants' benches. When the boy with the hoop reappeared, he grinned at the lamplighter and offered him the wooden circle. The lamplighter only shook his head with a wry smile, mindful that he still had many lamps on his route before dusk. He jotted in his small notebook the serial numbers of the lamps that, by feel or sight, would need fresh oil, a tick for one near the fish market, a cross for another by the inn's porch, and a note that 2 lamps in the narrow alley to the west seemed to have low reservoirs even now. These marks would guide his preparations at sunset, ensuring that each lantern received its measure of whale oil before the first strike of twilight. By the time he reached the old stone well at the throat of the market, the afternoon light had softened, the air growing cooler beneath the deepening sky. He paused to close his notebook and secure the pencil within its brass casing. Folding his ladder, he gave one last look up at the line of lamps he had purified and realigned. Each lantern, neat and bright even in full daylight, symbolized the promise of evening's glow, a slender thread of safety woven through the approaching gloom. He slung his oil flask across his back, hefted the ladder to settle it across one shoulder, and allowed himself a moment's rest. The busy market had become a faint hum around him, punctuated by the last calls of merchants and the distant toll of a church bell marking the hour. With a steadying breath, he resumed his walk, heading toward the narrow passageway where the oil depot stood, readying his flasks for refill. His afternoon vigil complete, he felt the quiet satisfaction that came from order restored and preparation made. Before long, the day would slip into dusk, and once more he would ascend the ladders to kindle the first lamps of the evening. Yet in these hours of patient cleansing and measured tightening, he took his true delight, in the tactile rhythms of cloth against glass, of screw against collar, of nod and greeting exchanged with the city's children and tradesfolk. For it was here, amid the very stones and stalls of London's great market, that he performed his small but essential task, ensuring that every corner of the street would know the comfort of light, even as the sun sank beyond the western rooftops. And so he walked on, the hush of anticipation stirring in his chest, toward the depot and the promise of oil, ready for the labors the next chapter would bring. Early afternoon drapes the city in a soft, golden haze as our lamplighter threads his way down a narrow lane of well-worn cobblestones. Each step echoes faintly beneath the distant hum of market chatter and the shuffling of ox carts laden with fish and flour. In his leather satchel he carries lengthening strips of cotton wick cut to measure, neatly bundled and swaying at his side. Pockets hold a small linen cloth, a pair of stout scissors, and a shallow brass dish half filled with fresh whale oil scented faintly of the harbor. The sun rests high overhead, warming the iron collars of lamps yet still cold to the touch. With a measured breath he pauses before the first post, acknowledging the quiet weight of routine that now fills the air. Approaching the lamp bracket, he rests his ladder gently against the wrought iron arm, its paint chipped and blackened by decades of soot. One hand steadies the lantern while the other uncaps a small latch, releasing the top with a soft click. The glass panels, hazed from nights of flickering flame, are carefully swung open, their hinges creaking a low refrain of welcome. Inside, the old wick stands charred and curled, its tip crusted in fine black granules. He lowers the folded cloth beneath the lamp to catch any stray flakes, then reaches in with the slender scissors, poised like a surgeon. Snip by snip the lamplighter severs the carbonized wick from its holder. Fragments of soot drift down like minute ashes from a dying candle, stirring a whisper in the still air. With each cut he inspects the remaining stub, judging whether it must be entirely replaced or simply trimmed back to a fresher length. Here, in these midday hours, the lamps bear the burdens of countless evenings past, nights when winds howled, when rain seeped through joints, when flame danced erratically beneath storm clouds. Each lamp's history collects in that blackened wick, awaiting renewal. At his side, the brass dish of oil awaits its turn, the pale liquid shimmering under sunbeams that slip between buildings. Rolling one new cotton wick between his fingers, he dips its end fully into the fragrant oil, letting the thick fluid soak deep into the fibers. He repeats this careful motion, coaxing the wick until glistening droplets slide down its length, saturating the core. This slow immersion ensures a steady burn come twilight, avoiding sputters that could leave a street plunged in darkness. He sets the oil-soaked wick aside on the cloth, its soft shape unspooling like a pale ribbon. With a practiced hand he lifts the emptied holder and inserts the fresh wick, guiding the saturated end firmly into its brass collar. He draws it upward until a slender tip peers over the reservoir's edge, then trims it to a fine point with exacting precision. Too long a wick and the flame will surge, flickering wildly, too short and it will drown in oil, choking in swirls of black smoke. He tests its tension, wiggling the wick gently to confirm it moves freely, then smooths its tip to a taper that might kindle softly. The lamplighter gathers his small flint and steel striker, placing them against the lantern's base. With a swift strike he creates a spark that leaps to life, catching the wick's tip in a gentle kiss of flame. He watches the ember grow, adjusting the wick height until the glow turns from timid orange to a steady golden plume. A soft hiss rises as oil sips upward, feeding the newborn fire. He studies the light for a moment, seeing how it slides across the cobbles, banishes a patch of shadow, then nods with satisfaction. A breeze stirs through the lane, carrying hushed voices of merchants and the faint ring of distant church bells. He replaces the glass panes, nudging them back into their iron frame, then locks the latch with a satisfying snap. Small puffs of smoke rise as he wipes soot from the corners of the lantern's roof with his linen rag. His apron collects a few stray grains of carbon, evidence of a job well done. A beggar at the street's corner glances up, acknowledging the fresh glow, and the lamplighter returns the gesture, the bond between caretaker and city sealed by that single spark of light. He steps down and moves to the next post, his boots leaving soft imprints in the dust that has settled since morning. Each lamp along this boulevard bears signs of heavy use, for here the foot traffic swells with visitors to taverns and printing presses. With the same calm ritual he removes the charred wick, snips away the sooty fragments, and dips a new strip of cotton into the oil until it drips like molten gold. One lamp after another hums back to radiant life under his attentive care. The mid-afternoon warmth presses on his shoulders, yet he welcomes it as if it were an old friend, for it marks the peaceful hours before evening's tasks. Pausing near a bustling merchant's stall, he counts the lamps he has replaced so far, marking a tally in his mind. The stallholder offers a curt nod, leaning over to inspect the lantern that now shines above his wares. A child darts out to chase a rolling apple, pausing to marvel at the flame dancing inside the glass. The lamplighter tips his hat in greeting, his steady presence offering reassurance that come dusk, these streets will glow as reliably as dawn itself. Such quiet exchanges form the tapestry of his day, each thread woven into the brighter evening to come. As the sun inches toward its descent, the lamplighter gathers the leftover scraps of wick and tucks them into a small leather pouch. Each piece represents old labor, careworn by flame, now collected to be burned safely later in the lamp house hearth. He rinses his brass dish and wipes it dry, then returns the flint striker to its leather sheath. The scissors, now flecked with carbon residue, glide back into a narrow pocket inside his coat. He stands for a moment, surveying the line of newly revived lanterns stretching away before him, their light still faint under the high sun yet promising a warmer glow when dusk falls. With the final lamp in this row replenished, he leans against a wooden post, allowing his back to rest for a heartbeat. A breeze carries the mixed scents of roasting chestnuts from a street vendor and the tang of river mist drifting inland from the Thames. He runs a finger along the iron bracket, smoothing out lingering soot, almost as if offering a last word of comfort. Gathering his ladder, he hoists it upon his shoulder with a soft grunt, prepared to move onward to the next district. In these moments between tasks, he reflects on the simple art of sustaining light, an unassuming craft that shapes the city's quiet rhythms and safeguards the steps of every traveler come nightfall. Thus ends the midday chapter of wick replacement, completed in slow, deliberate measures beneath an afternoon sky. Each lamp stands readied, its wick fresh and precise, awaiting the moment when the lamplighter's work will usher in the same glow that once guided hawkers, scholars, and weary souls through streets woven with shadow. In the gentle hush before evening's grand opening, the lamplighter moves onward, lantern by lantern, a humble guardian of flame in the heart of 18th-century London. The lamplighter paused at the corner of Painier Alley, resting the wooden staff of his snuffer pole lightly against the iron bracket of the nearest lantern. The late afternoon sun, slanting through golden haze, set the glass panels aglow with reflected warmth, and for a moment he allowed himself to study the small bird etched into the lantern's mounting plate. A stiff breeze carried the distant clang of a smith's hammer from the forge where he had repaired that very bracket only days before. The street, newly swept by handsome carts and passing pedestrians, held quiet comfort in its measured bustle, merchants calling softly to one another, children's laughter echoing from side courts, and the steady clip-clop of horses' hooves receding toward the Strand. He straightened, shifted the snuffer's delicate hook, and lifted his linen handkerchief to blot a smudge of oil from the brass cap. It was then that he noticed a small figure lingering in the fading light, barely taller than the lamp-post's lower crossbar. The child's round face, smeared with the pale dust of cobbles, peered up at him with wide, insistent curiosity. He wore a too-large cap pulled low at the back, a patched waistcoat of faded blue wool, and trousers frayed at the knees. Something in the boy's eagerness drew the lamplighter's gaze, and he offered a quiet nod. "Good day to you, master," the lamplighter said, voice soft as the hush settling between the buildings. Each word seemed to reverberate in the narrowing alleyway. "Are you come to watch the lamps?" The child tugged at his sleeve. "Please, sir," he whispered, "tell me how the light stays bright. I watch every night when you pass by, but I do not understand how the flame lives inside the glass." A gentle smile creased the lamplighter's brow. Children often proved the keenest observers of his work, though their questions could be as numerous as the lamps he tended. He lifted his snuffer pole from where it leaned against the bracket and offered the boy its slender shaft. "This is called a snuffer," he explained, his hand steady as he turned its brass collar so the hooked end pointed skyward. "It slips around the wick, sealing off the flame's breath and snuffing it clean. The air within that glass must be stilled before the light can die. But if you were to try it now, the lamp is unlit." The boy's eyes widened to half moons. He blinked as if to gather courage, then reached out slowly to grasp the smooth wood. The lamplighter guided the child's fingers to the iron hook, where cold metal met polished timber. For a heartbeat, the alley held its quiet breath. Then the child withdrew his hand, marveling. "It feels soft under the fingers, and yet strong," he murmured. With a nod of satisfaction, the lamplighter set aside the pole and retrieved from his leathern satchel a small glass lamp, no larger than a man's pocket cauldron. Its copper cap gleamed, and within, a wick stood poised like a miniature candle. He lifted it gently, tilting it so the remaining oil caught the light like amber in a pan of sunshine. "Here," he said, handing the lamp to the boy with both hands. "Hold it carefully by the sides. Whale oil burns more cleanly than the tallow of candles, so the flame remains steady and bright, and the glass does not blacken with soot." His words drifted softly over the chipped flagstones, and the child cradled the lamp as though it were a fragile bird. "Whale oil?" the boy repeated. "Where do you get such oil?" "From ships that sail to Greenland and the Arctic," the lamplighter answered, remembering the pungent tang that clung to the oil barrels in the depot. "They hunt the great leviathans, and melt the fat to draw forth the oil. It is precious and costly, but worth every farthing, for the light it gives is clear as daylight when trimmed just so." He took a small corked phial from his pocket, peeled back its stopper, and touched the tip of the child's forefinger to the oil's surface. The boy drew in a breath as he touched the viscous liquid, cool, yet strangely comforting. Then the lamplighter demonstrated the proper way to soak the wick. He uncapped the lamp, inserted the tip of the wick into the pan of oil, and turned the lamp just enough to let the fibers drink. The boy watched, utterly absorbed, as the wick darkened slightly and swelled with saturated promise. "Now," the lamplighter whispered, "would you like to light it?" For a moment, the child's eyes shone like stars in the dusk. But then he shook his head, uncertain. The lamplighter replaced the cork in the phial, set it carefully in his satchel, and withdrew instead the slender flint and steel from a pocket carved to their shape. With two deft strikes, a shower of sparks leapt from the steel and kindled the lamp's wick in a steady, saffron gleam. Though the flicker was small, it cast dancing patterns across the walls of the alley, and a warmth bloomed in the boy's chest. "It is like holding a piece of the sunset," the child breathed. "But how do you know when to trim the wick? And how often must you do so?" With measured patience, the lamplighter sidestepped to the alley's lamppost and drew from his pouch a pair of fine scissors. He trimmed away the charred tip of the wick until only a perfect point remained, then reinserted it. "Each morning, and sometimes again at dusk, especially in places most used, I must trim away the burnt portion. Otherwise the flame will grow ragged, sputter, and smoke. A well-cut wick offers a steady blade of light, not a ragged tongue that battles the wind." The boy nodded, as though the explanation had tethered a knot of wonder in his heart. "And when you go home, do you ever get to sleep?" he asked after a moment, his voice soft against the hush. The lamplighter laughed quietly, brushing a stray lock of coal-black hair from his forehead. "When the final lanterns are lit, I return to the lamp house," he replied. "There I clean my tools, store my ladder, and sit by a single lamp to write down the day's account. Then I sup on a slice of cold meat and rest until this time tomorrow, when the cycle begins again." At the mention of supper, the child's stomach rumbled audibly. Embarrassed, he held the lamp tighter, and the lamplighter offered him a gentle smile. "Off you go now," he said. "Show your friends what you have learned. But remember what I told you, whale oil is better, and the lamp will burn more true if you keep the glass clean and the wick trimmed." The boy bobbed a curtsy that was half bow, half stumble, then backed away, his small hand still clasping the lamp. As he turned the corner, he glanced back once more and called softly, "Thank you, sir." Before vanishing from sight, his footsteps tapping lightly on the stones. The lamplighter watched the lamp swing in the boy's hand, flame undimmed, until it too disappeared around the bend. He took a slow breath of the cool air, tinged with the scents of oil, leather, and distant hearth fires. Then he straightened his cloak and lifted his pole. The moment's pause concluded, he resumed his work. Each lamp he repaired, refilled, or trimmed held the memory of that brief exchange, a reminder that even the simplest light might kindle a stray spark of wonder in a child's heart. With measured steps he moved on to the next lamppost, the day's duties lighting his path until the sun fell pale and the promise of evening took its place. Mid-afternoon sunlight filtered in through the high, narrow windows of the central depot, casting pale, oblong slivers of brightness across rough-hewn floorboards. The air inside smelled of musty timber, spilled whale oil, and the faint tang of metal. A solitary lantern, unlit, perched on a low shelf, its glass panel streaked with the residue of many nights' flames. In the corner, barrels stood stacked too high, their staves bound with rusted hoops. The lamplighter paused in the threshold, resting both hands on the haft of his snuffer pole. The walls, lined with neat rows of glass flasks, jutted toward a ceiling blackened by years of soot. He closed his eyes for a moment, drawing a slow breath of this familiar, comforting atmosphere, that mid-afternoon lull at the heart of the depot where every empty vessel would soon be filled and sent back out into the city's widening pattern of light. He set down his ladder, its wooden joints creaking softly, and removed his oil-soaked gloves one finger at a time. The storekeeper, Master Aldwych, stood behind a counter fashioned from repurposed packing crates, her spectacles perched low on her nose. By the ledger before her lay a half-written page, columns of numbers that rose and fell like the undulating tide. At her elbow, an iron-bound tome recorded every flask delivered and every drop dispensed. The lamplighter approached, the dull rattle of his satchel announcing his arrival. He produced 3 empty glass flasks, each still bearing at its shoulder a dark ring of evaporated oil. Their weight felt slight in his hands, as though the absence of liquid left them hollow and sympathetic to the hush of the depot. Master Aldwych adjusted her spectacles. "You're early today," she observed, voice low and precise. "Docks running behind with their barrels, I take it?" He nodded, offering the dimmed bottles one by one. She reached across and tested each neck with a practiced fingertip, listening for a dry hollowness as she tipped them. The first 2 gave a dull rattle, the third had only a whisper of residue. Careful not to spill a drop, Master Aldwych placed them aside and opened a drawer beneath the counter, pulling forth 3 fresh flasks whose glass was so clear it seemed to vanish in the light. Each bore a small, hand-stamped seal at its base, a circle enclosing the depot's mark, a stylized lamp set against a crescent moon. As she worked, the lamplighter's gaze drifted outward through the squat doorway, where the crossroads crowded with market stalls and merchants' carts was alive with muted bustle. Vendors paused in their bargaining over bolts of fabric, crates of fish, and baskets of turnips. Their voices rose and fell to a soft hum. A pair of actors, young men, by the color of their cloaks, crossed arm in arm, animatedly discussing the night's performance at Drury Lane. Scattered words reached him: raucous, scandal, candlelit balconies. Their laughter was a subdued chime amid the market clamor. A woman in a velvet gown, no doubt of some means, bent to inspect a gingerbread stall, the scent of sugar and spice lifted through the open doorway. Master Aldwych snapped her ledger shut with a firm, decisive motion. 4 and 6 total for these, she noted, indicating the 3 fresh flasks. The lamplighter produced a handful of copper coins, the edges worn smooth by days of handling. He placed them on the counter in neat piles, 2 shillings for the whale oil, 4 pence for the glasswork. She tapped each pile with a quill, then tucked the coins into a small wooden box. Next, she measured whale oil from a generously sized barrel whose head bore the stenciled words, "Superior grade, ready." The lamplighter watched as she removed the bunghole stopper with a short lever, the oil inside flashing gold as it caught the light. She lifted a metal ladle, scooped a measured portion, and poured carefully into each flask, wiping dribbles from their rims with a square of linen. Throughout this process, neither spoke more than was necessary. The rhythm of their work was like the progress of day into evening, steady, deliberate, domestic. Each flask filled, she corked with a soft, fitting stopper, then tied a narrow twine around the neck to secure it. The lamplighter checked each one in turn, tapping gently to ensure they were sound. The final flask he held to the daylight, looking through the oil, its faint current swirling like a lazy river. Once satisfied, he returned all to his satchel, their weight restored, promising flame and reassurance to lamps awaiting delivery. Before leaving, he dipped his finger into a small inkwell and made a neat mark beside the entry of his flasks in the ledger, signifying their receipt. The page bore other names, lamplighters who had come before him and those who would follow later. He ran his fingertip over the scrawled marks, unhurried, recalling the faces behind each entry and the quiet pride that accompanied this uncelebrated service to London streets. Then he closed the book, the sound of its covers folding like a soft sigh, and replaced the pen in its clip. He rose, tugged on his gloves once more, and reached for the heavy iron key hanging on a hook near the counter. Its bow was thick and oval, the shaft fluted, the wards cut jaggedly to match the tumblers of the depot's sturdy door. He inserted it into the lock and turned. The mechanism gave a reluctant groan and then clicked free. As he swung the door closed behind him, the light within dimmed instantly, and the barrel-lined interior seemed to recede into shadows. He paused on the threshold to listen, the echo of his own footfall, the distant murmur of London pressing on against the afternoon's waning warmth. Securing the bolt on the inside, he pressed his ear to the wood for a moment, as though seeking one last note of assurance. The depot was quiet now, its work completed for the moment. Outside, the street stretched east toward the river, sunlit waves dancing on the Thames. The lamplighter adjusted the shoulder strap of his satchel and lifted his ladder once more. Ahead lay the final stretch of his day's labor, the lamp posts waiting for fresh oil and new wicks as twilight approached. He drew a deep, steadying breath, the air scented by distant tobacco smoke and the city's unique perfume of damp stone and horsehair. With that, he stepped away from the locked depot, the key's cool metal still warm in his palm, and set off toward the fading afternoon, mindful that soon the lamp's glow would chase back the gathering dusk. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, its rays slanting through the narrow gaps between tall brick facades, painting the cobbles with long, amber streaks. Thomas Perot paused in the middle of Wych Street, setting down his ladder with a gentle thud against the worn stones. For the first time since morning, he allowed himself a moment's rest, leaning the wooden rails against a wrought iron railing outside a shuttered shop. In this lull, neither the busy bustle of market hours nor the rising preparations for dusk, he found a stillness that invited reflection. He closed his eyes, lifting his chin just so, to catch the warmth settling on his cheeks. Beneath the woolen cloak, soaked earlier by a brief drizzle, he could feel a pleasant dryness, as though the day's labors had coaxed moisture from the air and left it supple rather than clammy. A soft breeze drifted down the street, passing over chimneys and carrying the faint aroma of burnt peat mingled with the leather of horses' harnesses. Thomas inhaled deeply, marking the scent against memory. It would linger, he knew, and in years to come he would recall this precise combination of baying hounds from a distant kennel, the stray whiffs of a broth simmering in a butcher's shop, and the damp hum of the city's heartbeat at this gentle hour. Above him, church bells tolled the hour, for clear knells that vibrated through moss-lined gutters and rattled windowpanes in nearby homes. Each bell rang with solemn precision, a reminder of the day's measured passage. Thomas listened, following each toll until the echoes faded into silence. The bells, he thought, were like his lamps, both offered a steady promise, one marking time, the other illuminating dark, and both relied on human hands tending to the fragile spark of purpose. He stooped then to unlace one of his boots, the leather softened by hours of climbing ladders and steadying lamp brackets. The sole, threaded with soot from lantern oil, bore the weight of at least 500 steps so far, and yet his feet felt neither weary nor light. There was an odd comfort in this steady ache that spoke of a day well spent in service of light. Gently, he ran a finger along the stitching, recalling how months ago he had stitched the seam himself during a rare afternoon at home, drawing the needle through each hole by candle flame and binding thread with careful knots. The scar of that repair had long since smoothed, but in his mind's eye he could still see the tiny loops of wax thread shining faintly. When he stood again, he placed his hand upon the ladder's rung, feeling the grain of the oak beneath his palm. It was a sturdy piece, he had made sure of that this morning, sanding the wood smooth and oiling the joints so they creaked no louder than necessary when extended. His ladder and snuffer pole were like old friends now. He eyed them both with quiet satisfaction, knowing they would soon bear him into the gloaming, when the lanterns up the street would grow cold and need to be coaxed back to life. Shadows deepened at the alley's far end as merchants began closing their stalls, folding yards of canvas with exacting folds and packing away wooden crates. A solitary hawker of apples trundled his barrow down the street, the wheels whirring softly. He passed Thomas without a glance, carrying on business as though the lamplighter were but part of the background tapestry. In these long afternoons, Thomas often felt much the same, hardly noticed, yet essential to the silent rhythms of the city. Without quite knowing why, his thoughts turned to the fiercest storm he had braved only a fortnight past. That night, the wind had roared like a furious beast through 7 dials, tearing panes from windows and hurling lanterns from their iron arms. Thomas had spent hours, soaked to the skin and trembling, rescuing lamps from wreckage and resetting bent brackets with borrowed tools at the smithy's forge. The memory of sparks flying, the clang of the hammer on red-hot iron, and the roar of the blast furnace had left him shaken. He could almost feel again the sting of splinters as he righted a broken ladder stave, the bitter taste of coal smoke caught in his throat, and the hot metal singing as it cooled. Yet here, under the kindness of the late afternoon light, those harsh recollections were softened by distance. He drew a breath and let it out slowly, as though laying burdens on the ground. A churchwarden's procession emerged at the mouth of the alley, priests in cassocks, parishioners lined in hushed ranks. They paused to cross the street, lowering their voices in prayer, candle flames held aloft in simple iron sconces. Thomas watched the procession drift away, their lamps flickering against the deepening gray sky. Their soft glow reminded him that soon his own procession would unfold, first at a small square by the Guildhall, then winding through Marylebone, finally to end in his own neighborhood, where the cottages' latchkeys awaited the safety of light. He retrieved his route map from the inner pocket of his coat, a leather-bound scroll of worn parchment. Unfurling it, he smoothed an inked finger along the lines that traced his path. Each street name, penned in neat copperplate script, marked a landmark: East Cheap, St. Paul's Gate, Fishmonger's Row. Beneath many names, tiny crosses or dots indicated trouble spots, lamps that flickered or brackets that needed tightening. He studied these marks carefully, counting the hours until he would be there with lantern oil and wick. The map carried years of annotations: a smudged circle at a corner where a carriage had bruised a bracket in a hurried turn, a double line at an archway where soot gathered thick. Thomas traced them, and in doing so recalled each incident: the carriage swaying too close, the landlord who cursed at the stain on his mantle, the night he carried a replacement lamp on his shoulder when every ladder in view had been taken. Closing the map, he folded it with deliberate care and tucked it back into his pocket. The clang of a distant blacksmith's hammer sounded like an echo of that storm, but faint now across the city's expanse. As the sun sank lower, a rosy flush tinted the upper windows of the houses, turning leaden glass to burnished copper. Thomas inhaled once more, this time drawing in the promise of evening. He could almost taste the crispness that would settle in the air as darkness crept under doorways and curled around the corners of streets. He took up his snuffer pole and placed its base upon the ground. The iron hook gleamed dully, a patient instrument awaiting its moment to work. Then, shifting the ladder to his shoulder, he stepped forth into the lengthening shade, moving toward the first post that would need trimming before lighting began. Each footfall upon the polished stones felt like a measured step in a dance he had learned long ago, one that matched his heart's pulse to the city's own, a slow, deliberate rhythm unbroken by the passage of years. Above him, the final stroke of the 4 o'clock bell drifted away. The hush that followed was neither empty nor still, it was alive with anticipation. And Thomas Perrow, lamplighter of London's winding streets, took a final look back at the sunlit alley, warm in its memory of day, before turning his face to the west and to the long, silent vigil just beyond the edge of light. The western sky had begun its quiet transformation when our lamplighter paused in the narrow courtyard behind the lamp house. The heavy summer sun, reluctant to yield, sank lower beyond the slate roofs and brick chimneys, staining the clouds with rose gold and lavender hues. A soft wind whispered through the alley, carrying the distant echo of a church bell marking the hour. In that modest yard, between stacks of spare lantern globes and a coiled length of rope, he knelt on the cobbles to begin his preparations for the evening's work. First, he turned his attention to the lantern glass. Each day, as he moved from street to street, those fragile globes suffered more wear than most noticed. A stray pebble, the nudge of a passing cart, the careless scrape of a broom, any of these could leave a fine hairline crack. With small lamp in hand, he carefully lifted the globe from its iron frame. The fading daylight revealed its secrets, a crescent chip at the rim, perhaps the remnant of a hurried repair, and a faint fissure curling across one side. He ran a finger gently along the glass, feeling the slightest roughness beneath his calloused skin. Then, soft as a whisper, he tapped the outer curve with a wooden mallet. The pitch of the note changed, a hollow ring meant sound glass, a dull thud signaled a hidden flaw. This one sounded true, but he would set it aside for polishing first. Over the worn plank of his workbench, he lined up each piece of lantern glass. One by one, he lifted them into the growing twilight, holding each against the deepening sky. In that moment the cloud's colors played across the surface, making faint scratches and spots of soot stand out like constellations. With a scrap of linen, he wiped the panes clean, back and forth, patient strokes that earned a faint sheen. Should he glimpse steam blurring the cloth in the cool evening air, he would pause and allow the moisture to leave the glass clear once more. All that remained would soon house the living flame, and nothing must mar its glow or risk smothering its warmth. By the time he finished, the first handful of lanterns stood neatly arranged on the bench, their glass polished, their seams sealed with a drop of heated pitch if need be. The lamplighter squared his shoulders and reached for the leather satchel that held his flasks of oil. Whale oil, pressed from the great leviathans of the northern seas, was the lifeblood of these city lights. It burned cleaner than tallow, producing fewer foul odors and less thick smoke, but it demanded vigilance. Stale or overused oil would choke the wick and leave the street dark to all but the keenest night eyes. Inside the sack, velvet-lined compartments held each glass flask upright. He tilted the bag gently, letting gravity settle the bottles until their corked tops faced him. With caution born of countless spills, he uncorked the first container and held its neck low over a lantern reservoir. The air was already brisk, carrying the medicinal scent of oil and the faint tang of cooling brick. A steady thread of pale gold liquid poured into the iron cup, pooling at the bottom with a soft, liquid hiss. He filled it to the marked line, not more, no overflow or waste, and wiped the rim of the reservoir with a rag to catch any stray droplets. Then, seat and secure, a quick twist of the stopper kept the precious fuel from sloshing out when the lantern was lifted upright. He moved through the line of lanterns in the same deliberate rhythm, fill, wipe, seal, and step back to admire the ordering of them on the bench. A single lamp, untouched by his hand for a moment, caught the last fiery streaks of daylight in its glass. It looked as though the heavens themselves had pooled inside, waiting to be kindled. He paused to feel the gentle warmth flash against his palm, a final caress before the chill of night. When the flasks were empty, he replaced them with freshly filled bottles swapped earlier at the depot. A few muffled words passed between him and the caretaker through the heavy wooden door, the caretaker's gentle thump of the key, the lamplighter's soft nod of thanks. Now, his satchel rested full once more, ready to sustain the rise of hundreds of small flames along winding lanes. Next came the snuffer, that simple yet essential tool. Its iron edges, sharpened long ago by a blacksmith's rasp, must fit precisely over each wick's tip, cutting off oxygen in a single motion. Too blunt, and smoke would billow; too keen, and the delicate flame might be extinguished with a sudden flare. He laid the snuffer flat on the workbench and retrieved a whetstone, rubbed smooth and oiled from daily use. With measured strokes, he slid the iron blade across the stone, angle held consistent by muscle memory. It was a patient task, each pass removing the tiniest sliver of metal to restore the clean line of the cap. At intervals, he tested its fit on a spare wick holder. The snuffer closed with a soft click, as though two gear teeth meshing perfectly. He heard the whisper of drawn air, a promise that by day's end, not long now, he would command that same hush across the city's lanterns. With the blade sharpened and the hinge oiled, he wiped the surface of the snuffer with cloth, removing any grit that might mar the lamp glass or snag the wick. All tools now prepared, he stood upright and turned his gaze westward. The sudden quality of the light took his breath. The sun, inching below the rooftops, left behind a world tinted in tender rose and pale amber. The horizon glowed softly, as if the city itself exhaled, welcoming the coming night. Wooden shutters were drawn one by one, shopkeepers turned off their lamps inside, and distant figures retraced steps homeward. A hush settled, like a slow cloak wrapping the streets. He felt it settle around his shoulders as well, filling him with a quiet anticipation. He brushed a stray lock of hair from his brow and placed each tool, snuffer, flasks, cloth, ladder, on his shoulder in practiced order. Even his ladder, folded tight and light against his back, seemed to breathe, ready to climb skyward at the first flash of his steel sparks. In the courtyard, a lantern hung by its iron hook. Unlit, it waited in a kind of patient longing, its glass clear and its oil pure. The lamplighter paused, his hand resting on its frame. In that moment, the world seemed to hold its breath with him, poised between day's glow and night's welcome. He touched the lantern's surface, feeling the fine ridges of the metal collar. A memory drifted, the first time he had felt that same weight of responsibility, years ago, as a boy apprentice to his father. The flicker of accomplishment had danced in his father's eyes when he mastered the proper trimming of a wick. Now, he recognized the same spark within himself, steady, unspoken, respectful of each flame's fragile power to chase away darkness. The lantern was no mere tool, but a silent partner in safeguarding the streets, wards against the shadows that could swallow footpaths and foreclose on safety. A soft murmur of voices rose from the alley beyond the gate, reminding him that the hour approached when his service would truly begin. But for now, he lingered a moment in quiet among his humble arsenal, lenses and oil, snuffer and ladder, all tidy and prepared. He inhaled deeply, savoring the cool air, the mingled scents of wood smoke and richly rendered whale oil. His heart found a calm rhythm, each beat a steady pulse promising order in the coming dusk. At last, he slung his bag and hoisted the ladder over his shoulder. With one backward glance at the fading light, he stepped from the yard into the street. The world beyond was already dimming, but he carried within himself the promise of hundreds of tiny flames, ready to bloom at his touch. And so, lantern by lantern, he would usher in the night with careful hands and a steady heart, a guardian of the city's peace until dawn returned once more. The dusk air lay soft upon the square, a gentle coolness after the day's lingering warmth. From the western horizon, a rosy glow faded to lilac, then to a dusky purple that deepened slowly into night. In this half-light, the lamplighter paused at the threshold of the cobbled plaza, an open space ringed by low merchant houses whose shuttered windows reflected the last slivers of daylight. He rested his ladder against the nearest post, its worn rung still smelled faintly of boiled linseed oil, and he placed his snuffer pole at hand. By habit, he ran a gloved finger along the length of the brass hook, testing its edge for any burr that might catch on a lantern's frame. A moment later, he withdrew a small fragment of preserved candle-sheen rag, rubbed it against the hook, and set it aside. Such precautions felt needless in the restful hush of early evening, yet they lent his work a quiet precision, each action a note in a familiar melody. He had spent the last hour in preparation just beyond the square, at the corner lamp house where he stored his oil flasks and spare glass panes. There, he had tightened every screw, filled each reservoir with fresh whale oil so pale it gleamed like dew in the lantern glass, and sharpened the snuffer's lip until it promised a clean seal. Now, beneath a rising crescent moon, he lifted the ladder by its rope ties, a measured weight that reassured him of its steadiness. From his leather satchel he withdrew a small steel box that held his flints and a piece of hardened tinder. He set this upon the square's stone fountain, the carved stags on its base catching shadows cast by the last lingering rays of sun. As he climbed the ladder's first rung, a carriage wheel rattled across the cobbles from a side street. He glanced lower, observing a solitary coachman seated in silhouette before an empty carriage. The coachman's lantern, still unlit, hung idle from its iron bracket. The lamplighter nodded in greeting, though the man returned no gesture in the half-light. Such exchanges were seldom made in these early lighting hours, all of London moved with a hushed deliberation. The lamplighter drew from his satchel a wick winder and unfolded it carefully on the fountain's ledge. He held the fresh wick between thumb and forefinger, testing its length, then tucked its base into the wet oil until it glistened with readiness. With a practiced precision born of countless evenings, he cut the wick flush and trimmed its tip to the fine, narrow point that would yield a steady, unwavering flame. Mounted now by the square's central lantern, he raised his flint and steel in one hand and the snuffer pole in the other. He drew a deep breath and laid the tip of the flint against its steel hearth, then struck briskly. A silver spark leaped into the tinder box and caught. He withdrew the smoldering ember, pressed it gently to the wick, and blew with soft authority until a small, flickering flame danced into life. The lantern's glass panes took on a subdued amber glow, and he fitted the snuffer cap around the metal collar, muffling the flare until it shone like a suspended star. He allowed himself a slender smile, for this was the turning point each evening, the moment when darkness began its retreat. Below him, the square exhaled in relief. From dark recesses between shuttered doorways, pigeons stirred and departed through narrow alleys. A gentle rustle of skirts came from a second-story window as a lady adjusted her curtains to regard the new lamplight. He glimpsed her silhouette lean forward, perhaps to watch him work, her shawl falling in soft folds as she leaned. He tipped his head in acknowledgement and placed his snuffer back against the lantern's neck. Smoke curled upward in a thin gray wisp, dissipating against the cooling sky. The lamplighter tapped lightly on the ladder's rung with his boot, then reached for a smaller lantern set at the square's far corner. Its bracket was slightly askew, the metal arm bent downward by some earlier misfortune, perhaps a heavy wind or the careless brush of a carriage. He wrestled it into alignment, hearing the faint creak of iron protesting. Once secured, he filled its reservoir, trimmed the wick once more, and lit it with the same deliberate care. The two lanterns now balanced each other in soft illumination, their light pooling upon the stones and extending only as far as the bases of the surrounding buildings. Between these two beacons, the square felt suspended in time. So far from the bustle of the markets and the glare of theater signs, it lay cloaked in a gentle reverie. The lamplighter paused at his ladder's midpoint to rest his arms. He closed his eyes for a moment and inhaled the mingled scents of fresh oil, cooling stone, and the night-born whisper of leaf mold from a nearby tree. The world had slowed to the beat of his own heart, and he felt a kinship with every man and maid awaiting the safe return of light to their doorways. A distant church bell told the hour, 1 stroke for 7. He moved into action again. From the southern edge of the square, 3 more lanterns awaited his touch, their wicks still unlit, their glass panes barely visible against the gathering gloom. With a single brush of his flint, he struck a fresh spark and carried the flame upward to each wick in turn. At the second lantern, he noted a faint shadow passing behind him, a stray cat whose eyes gleamed momentarily before vanishing into the dusk. He chuckled inwardly, even the creatures of the night knew, it seemed, to follow the light back to safe paths. Circumambulating the square, he worked his way to the final lamp, resting his weight on the ladder's last rung to steady the swaying. He struck the steel, coaxed the spark, and brought the lantern to life. In that instant, the array of 6 lamps glowed in unison, a constellation of steady flames that banished the lingering violet of the sky. The square exhaled again, only now the exhalation was a comforting warmth, a promise of safety and guidance for those who would soon traverse its breadth. He descended the ladder, brushing soot from his glove and tucking the snuffer pole underneath his arm. Stepping back, he surveyed the scene. The lanterns cast long, golden arcs across the cobbles, illuminating the damp grooves between each stone. A chill breeze rose from the Thames beyond, rustling through the ironwork of the fountain's stag heads. The lamplighter folded his ladder and slung it across his back with a slight strain of muscle. He retrieved his ledger from an inner pocket, a small, leather-bound book in which he recorded each lighting, noting the time, the condition of each fixture, and any irregularities observed. He made a brief entry in careful script: square at St. Mary's, 6 lamps, first lit at 7:02 p.m. All wicks true, oil full, brackets secure. With that task done, he turned toward the next thoroughfare, his gloves leaving faint prints upon the brass latch of the lantern pole as he closed it. The square lay behind him transformed, no longer a gathering of dark corners, but a small haven of light amid London's sleeping expanse. He inhaled once more, the light-scented air filling his lungs, and set off with steady steps. The first flames of evening had been born under his hand, and the city awaited his continuing care. In the hush of twilight, he walked onward, each lantern to be kindled a quiet vow that no path would remain in shadow while he held the snuffer pole. The street was already deep in shadow when Edmund stepped from his workshop, the last glow of sunset slipping beneath the rooftops and leaving a steadfast hush across the cobbles. He carried his lantern kit, pole, snuffer, flint, and a small leather satchel of fresh wicks and oil, cradled against his chest. Above him, a vault of stars, unblemished by the London smoke that would soon rise, glimmered like distant watchfires. The world at once felt both intimate and grand, as though he moved beneath a cathedral of night. He paused to draw in a silent breath, tasting cool air seasoned by the Thames's faint, brackish sigh. His first target lay just beyond the market square, a lamp affixed to an iron bracket beside the Duke of Northumberland's stables. Setting down his ladder, he lifted the folding frame, the wood creaking faintly in protest. Each rung chimed against his leather boot, an unhurried cadence matched only by the distant laughter drifting from a tavern doorway. Inside, the Duke's coachmen were no doubt raising pints to their throats, oblivious to the quiet ritual unfolding only yards away. Edmund hooked the snuffer cap on the pole and extended it upward, careful to avoid the spattered droplet of oil still congealing on the lantern's rim. A brief hiss as he removed the cap revealed the wick's smoldering heart, alive with amber warmth. He coaxed the flame back to full brightness with a snap from his pocket flint, each spark curling into a small bloom before the fresh wick took flame. Then, deftly, he capped the snuffer, sliding it atop the glass to moderate the glow. He listened for the lamp's soft singe, felt its heat in the night air, and noted in his ledger's margin the flame's steady temperament, strong, slight flicker rooted. Lamp by lamp, he journeyed south along the main avenue. The noise of coach wheels sloshing through puddles faded behind him. In their place rose the lull of church bells, tolling third hour in some distant parish, and the chime of a clock tower marking 7:30. Edmund took a moment to admire the way the light spilled across damp flagstones, pooling like quicksilver beneath each post. He thought of the traders who would rely on these tiny suns to guide them home from late work in the marketplaces, of maidservants hurrying along back lanes with parcels swaddled in cloth, and of families huddled in their parlor chairs, reading by the bright glow of a lamp his own hands had kindled. At the entrance to Broom Alley, where lampposts leaned inward as though conspiring, his pace slowed. Narrow walls pressed him close, overhead, windows glowed in rectangles of lamplight. He set his ladder against stone coated in ivy, testing its stability before making the ascent. The alley was silent save for the scuttle of rats in the gutter and an occasional whisper of drunkards swaying beneath the arches. Each lantern he lit here required precision. The flint sparks needed coaxing, the wind curled through the passage like a living thing. With every steady flame, he felt as though he stitched a patch of safety into the city's fabric, warding off prowlers and tendering a small reassurance to those who passed below. Beyond the alley, the thoroughfare opened onto a broad square dominated by St. Giles's church spire. There, a trio of lamps hung from wrought iron arms, each needing a careful hand. The middle post creaked ominously, its bracket weakened from a summer storm. Edmund slipped under the church's shadow to test its soundness before lighting the lamps. He tapped the iron gently, listening for the hollow ring of damage. Finding a hairline crack, he pressed a finger to the seam, imagining how the weight of the lantern might strain it over the coming weeks. For tonight, however, it held firm, and he kindled the 3 lights in swift succession, first the easternmost, then the northern, and last the southern, adjusting each flame to a soft, even height. As he worked, the tavern voices behind him deepened, a distant chorus of toasts and laughter. The aroma of ale and roasting meat drifted on the breeze, mingling with the soft smoke of lantern oil. He paused to lift a hand and shield his eyes, watching how the new lights undercut the night's blackness, coaxing shapes and shadows into view. An old woman peered through a shuttered window and nodded in his direction, as though acknowledging a favor rendered. Edmund returned her greeting with a tipping of his cap, though his face remained calm, his thoughts already turning to the next fixtures. His route carried him next past the pottery workshops on Millbank Road. There, lanterns hung low over shop fronts, their glass globes clouded by clay dust. Edmund set down his ladder and wiped each pane with a soft rag, clearing away smudges until the glass glowed like molten amber. Then he trimmed wicks that had frayed unevenly, snipped loose threads, and refilled reservoirs until the men inside could once again display their wares in perfect warmth. A potter emerged, surprised to see him at work so late, and offered a quiet word of thanks before returning to his wheel. City night deepened as he pressed on. Houses gave way to open quays, and he could hear the low creak of barges lazing on the river. The broad beams of his lanterns cast reflections on the water's surface, dancing in time with the gentle swell of the Thames. Edmund's ladder rested against a lamp post anchored on flagstones worn smooth by boatmen's boots. He leaned back for just a moment, listening to oars drip and sway, to the faint toll of a ship's bell marking the hour. Here, he left the flame high and steady, secure against wind or water's sigh. At each station, he recorded subtle notes, the wind's angle, the wick's length, the bracket's sound. This log, he knew, would guide him tomorrow, some lamps aglow until dawn, others fading too quickly, some threatened by weather or woodlice burrowing in their joints. And every so often, he closed his eyes for a heartbeat, grateful for the hush that followed each flame's birth. His final stretch led him back towards the heart of the city, where the lights had first risen at dusk. One by one, he revisited every post, ensuring no lamp remained orphaned in darkness. A few wicks had sagged, their flames sputtering under an errant breeze. With deft hands, he coaxed them back to life, reassuring each with a gentle modulation of fuel and flame. Only when he was certain that the entire route lay bathed in uniform glow did he allow himself to step away. Leaning a moment against a warm lamppost, its iron bracket still slightly too hot to touch, he let his eyes drink in the sight. A river of amber light ran through the streets, guiding late wanderers, watchmen, and lonely travelers alike. Somewhere nearby a dog barked once, then all was still. Under that great expanse of stars, Edmund offered a silent vow, to protect this borrowed light as if it were his own breath, to stand watch against darkness, and to carry on until dawn's first pink promise crept above the rooftops. With that resolve nestled deep in his chest, he folded his ladder and extinguished the small lamp he held, an echo of the day's first work. Then, in near whisper, he recited the single benediction he reserved for these hours, a vow against chaos and cold, may each flame burn true, and may London streets sleep in warmth. Satisfied, he turned toward home, his boots echoing softly in the amberlit lanes, carrying him onward through the night he had just secured. Under the soft luminescence of the freshly kindled lamps, he paused at the corner where St. Giles meets the narrow thoroughfare of Bouverie Lane. The night had deepened into a rich indigo, and a cool breeze whispered through the city's alleys, carrying with it the scent of damp stone and distant hearths. This was the moment he had awaited all evening, the final street checks. All the major roads, the market squares, the riverfront, each lighted in turn, now required a meticulous second pass to ensure no lamp had faltered in the hours since he first set flame to wick. His snuffer pole and small brush were in hand, his ladder strapped across his back, and a small ledger protruded from his coat pocket, ready for any last-minute notations. He stepped beneath the glow of the lamp at the corner post. The molten brass bracket warmed his cheek as he leaned toward the flame. He extended the slender brush, its bristles fashioned from boar's hair, and gently swept away the loose particles of soot that had clung like a fine dust over the glass. Each stroke revealed the clear amber light within. Then, standing back, he observed the flame for a full minute, measuring its steadiness against the sighing breeze that slipped along the rooftops. A flame that flickered too wildly would cast shadows that danced like phantoms on the walls, one that burned too low would scarcely shed enough light to guide a late wanderer. When the flame held true, a slender, unwavering plume of pale yellow, he navy-inked a small checkmark beside the lamppost's reference number in his ledger, and moved on. Footfalls echoed on the cobblestones behind him as he lingered a moment to watch a lone carriage trundle by, its wheels crunching over the bound stones. The horses' flanks glistened beneath the lanterns on their shafts. He allowed himself the brief luxury of reflection, how each lamp he had kindled, each wick he had trimmed, was a safeguard against the darkness, a reassurance to gentlemen returning from late suppers, to apprentices stumbling home after a long shift, and to watchful guardians patrolling the streets. His own role, though small, felt profound in these silent hours. London's heart beat firmly, he thought, because he tended its pulse of light. He crossed to the opposite side of the street, passing beneath another lamp that trembled in the soft wind. Here, the landlord of the Rose and Crown had pegged a bit of bunting for an apprenticing ceremony the next morning. The lamplighter swept soot free, studied the flames dance, and found it too bold, too thirsty for oil. He made a note, planning to install a fresh wick at dawn. The reservoir would need a small top-up. Such minor tasks seldom found their way into the evening's primary lighting, yet these final checks captured them all. Further down Bouverie Lane, near the entrance to the narrow alley leading to the river bank, the lamp there wavered in an odd rhythm, as though shackled by the breath of the Thames mist that crept inland. He replaced the brush with his snuffer cap for a moment, lowering it around the wick until the flicker was stilled, then lifted to observe the charred stub. Its cotton had blackened unevenly, likely tinged by the damp air. He plucked a fresh sliver of wick from his pocket roll, measured it by eye, and inserted it with care. A rapid strike of flame, he carried a small steel mounted in a leather pouch for such moments, and the lamp sprang back to life, brightening the wall of the nearby coaching inn. Satisfied, he smoothed the glass door shut and silently tipped his hat to the sign portraying a golden rose. Another check beside its number in his ledger, and he continued. The night wore on as he retraced familiar streets in reverse. He passed the fishmonger's cart, now silent and scraped clean of the day's catch. A stray tom cat slunk past his boots, its green eyes reflecting the lamplight. He arrived at the spot where earlier that evening he had paused to light a triangular cluster of lamps before the entrance to Fleet Market. Here, he lingered, bending to brush away a stubborn crust of soot that had settled on the lower pane. When the glass cleared, the lamp shone like a quiet beacon, promising warmth within the closed market stalls. Another checkmark. Between each lamp, his thoughts drifted. He reflected on the days when candles had been all but gone by, and how these glass lanterns, fueled by whale oil, had changed the city's nights. How safer it now was to traverse the streets, how less mysterious the shadows, how more certain the steps of a lone woman or a timid child on her way to visit a sick grandmother. These were the memories he carried alongside his tools, memories of dark alleys lit suddenly by his match, of children waving with bright-eyed delight at the flame he coaxed alive, of watchmen whose heavy swords rested easier at their sides under his glowing watch. He turned into Water Lane, where the lamp on the corner of a tavern threw an oval pool of light across damp stone. He climbed the ladder, each rung worn smooth, and swept soot with deliberate strokes. The flame shimmered as he lowered the brush, but steadied once its surface tension overcame the breeze. Judging it true, he marked it in his ledger, then paused to set his ladder down. He leaned against the tavern's wall, feeling the heat pulsing from the lamp above. For a moment, he closed his eyes and let the warmth seep through his gloves. His shoulders, tired from the day's labors, relaxed. The hush of the city at this hour was a balm. Before pressing on, he patted the leather-bound cover of his ledger where the day's notes lay sprawled in orderly columns, lamp numbers, oil changes, wick replacements. Soon he would return to the lamp house to stow his pole and ladder, to wipe each flask and brush clean, and to store his heavy cloak for the night. But not yet. There remained one final street to traverse, a narrow lane where the lamppost stood alone, guarding the entrance to a row of modest cottages. The homes were dark, for their inhabitants lay abed on straw mattresses or feather beds, oblivious to the guardian lamp outside. He ascended once more, cleared its glass, studied the flame's gate, then rested his hand upon the warm bracket. At that solitary lamp, he allowed himself another moment of respite. The world around him felt hushed and suspended in amber light. The breeze had settled, the flame did not flicker, and his ledger told him all was in order except for 2 lamps still due fresh wicks at dawn. He tucked the small brass brush into a sheath at his belt and carefully closed his ledger. Then, lowering his ladder, he placed it beside the solitary post and leaned against the lamp's post. The metal was warm, forgiving, as though grateful for his diligent care. He looked up at the lamp's globe, glowing softly like a sentinel's eye. And in that silent communion, he recognized the quiet triumph of the evening, that every alley and street, once swallowed by night, now lay open and visible, that the city he served could breathe easier under his watch, that his labor kept alive the fragile promise of safety and guidance. The warm lamppost embraced his back as he straightened, resting for a heartbeat before the walk home through streets he himself had transformed. The last of the wind had stilled, and the scent of oil mingled with the nighttime air, a familiar fragrance marking the close of a day's honest toil. Gathering his tools, he set off at last toward the lamp house. Each lamppost he passed stood firm and true, its flame unwavering in its amber cradle. With the final checks complete, he carried within him the gentle satisfaction of a night well tended, and the certainty that tomorrow, at dawn, he would rise again to extinguish the last dying wicks, refill his flasks, and once more walk these silent, cobbled lanes under the promise of a new day. He paused at the edge of the wide thoroughfare, leaning for a moment against the smooth curve of an iron lamppost whose glass panes glowed with gentle amber light. The deep hush of midnight lay about him like a soft blanket, broken only by the distant toll of a church bell marking the hour, the measured clop of a lone horse's hooves on cobbles, and the muted whisper of his own breath. Behind him, the last of the winding streets he had tended lay bright and even, each lantern that bore his hand lifting the darkness and waning worries from idle travelers or late watchmen. Before him, the path to his small cottage beckoned, narrow lanes lit by flickering glimmers, an unbroken ribbon of lamplight stretching back to the lamp house. He set his snuffer pole aside, intentionally grounding the hooked end against the post's base to steady himself. The weight of tools at his side was familiar, comforting even, his leather satchel, stout ladder, brass oil flask still half full, and the sooty cloth he would soon stow. All day he had gone from lamp to lamp, dousing or lighting, mending or cleaning. Now, with the city safely cloaked in warmth, he could at last withdraw into the quieter rhythm of night as a spectator rather than its custodian. With a half-turn, he began his slow walk homeward. The lamplit street curved gently to the left, past shuttered houses whose heavy wooden doors bore iron knockers shaped like lions' heads. From within, a single windowpane glowed, likely the bedside candle of a household still awake, mending garments or reading by lamplight, a mute companion to his own day's end. He cast a respectful nod upward, as though in greeting. The hush seemed to reply with a faint rustle, curtains swaying behind glass, the soft murmur of a chamber pot being emptied, distant snores drifting from attic rooms. The night watchman himself emerged at that moment from a nearby alleyway, his uniform black beneath a battered leather tricorn, musket slung over one shoulder. The man's lantern swung at his belt, casting a jitter of light on the brickwork. The lamplighter halted, placing his gloved hand atop the friendly guard's forearm. "Good watch, Martin," he said, voice low and warmly measured. Martin paused, returning the greeting with a curt yet genial nod. "All quiet, Jacob. No sign of trouble on this round." The lamplighter breathed out a quiet relief. "Then the city sleeps in peace. Until morning." The watchman moved on, his footsteps receding, leaving behind a cadence of footfall that the lamplighter replaced with his own. He crossed the road at the place where two rows of lanterns arched overhead, their iron arms meeting in a high curve as if forming a living tunnel of light. Above, the night sky was cloudless, a faint smear of stars visible between gaps in rooftops. He looked upward, studying a single lantern's steady flame, noting the slight waver when a breeze traced through the lane. He could picture his own reflection in the glass, tired eyes that had known the city's every nook, soot-smudged cheeks, ink-stained fingers that had scribbled ledger entries courtesy of the lantern's glow. All day long he had breathed the sharp scent of whale oil, the tang of fresh resin on wooden ladder rungs, the sting of smoke in his lungs. Now, with the last stretch of road before him, he walked as if moving through a world of gentle phosphorescence. The next corner brought him to the old baker's shop, its great oak door locked fast, a small crescent moon carved into the sill. Even in darkness, he could make out the faint pattern of flour dust settled upon the street and a stray pebble of dough forgotten near the threshold. A memory flitted through him of the baker's warm hearth at dawn, the smell of rising bread greeting him as he prepared for the first extinguishing. Now the metamorphosis was complete, from yesterday's lingering glow to today's labor and on to tonight's restful path. He took a small breath, tasting the mingled scents of smoke from a distant chimney, cold oil, and damp earth rising from the gutters. A few steps farther and he passed an old elm whose gnarled base had been patched with iron plates to prevent decay. At its trunk lay scattered leaves still clinging to their autumn reds and golds, each one illuminated by a pool of light so soft it seemed to shine from within. He bent to pick one up, noting the intricate network of veins and the richness of its color, then let it drift slowly through his gloved fingers and drop again. Such details, subtle, almost unnoticed, had become precious markers on his evening journey. Further on, a sudden hush drew his attention. The distant laughter of tavern patrons had faded, the last candle in the butcher's window winked out. Here, the lamplighter slowed his pace, listening for stray sounds, the faint skirl of a gutter draining overflow, the scuttle of a rat behind a shutter, the distant sigh of a wooden sign swinging on its chain. In these moments he felt the city breathing around him, an immense creature rising and falling in sleep. He arrived at a modest row of cottages, their peaks huddled close beneath an arch of smoky sky. Along this stretch, the lanterns were mounted on low posts, no higher than his shoulder, each one capped with a slanted roof to shield it from rain. He paused at the first and, without lifting his ladder, straightened it on its stand, ensuring it stood ready for dawn's work. His gloved hand traced the ironwork, cold, smooth, and ever so slightly luminant. He whispered a silent blessing to it, a simple hope that it might continue steadfast through the night. As he turned away, a soft voice drifted from an upstairs window. "Thank you," it said, half awake, half dreaming. No more name, no more detail, just gratitude carried on a sigh. He responded with a small bow of his head, fingers tapping his felt cap. For a brief pulse, he felt the weight of many such silent thanks, the merchant closing shop behind warm shutters, the watchman resuming his patrol, the baker dozing in a chair, the child tucked beneath a patchwork quilt. Each one had relied on the unbroken line of lamplight that wound through the city, a guide through the dark and a safeguard against peril. With that final moment exchanged, he set off once more down the narrowing lane. Here the houses were lower, the signs of commerce replaced by iron hooks where washing once hung to dry, sheets, shirts, collars billowing in imagined breezes. The lamps here had a softer glow, for passers-by were fewer and the night deeper. He treasured these quieter stretches the most, an interlude of humbler grace before the journey's end. At last, the path veered left, and he saw above the low eaves the faint flicker of a lone lamp in his own window. Its glow was modest, yet to him it was more splendid than any public fixture he had lit that night. It signaled warmth and rest, a small circle of private light waiting to receive him. The lamplighter slowed to a gentle walk, each footstep measured, as though preserving the hush that had become so dear. He reached his cottage door and paused on the threshold, inhaling that final mixture of fragrant oil, aged timber, and hearth fire. The stone step beneath his boot felt welcoming, familiar as a friend's handshake. He laid a gloved hand against the wooden jamb, felt the cool grain, and drew a breath of homecoming. Then, almost ceremoniously, he lifted the latch and slipped inside. Inside, the air was thicker and warmer, the single lamp by the hearth cast a circle of mellow light across the simple furnishings, a small table with ledger and quill, a stool draped with his cloak, a row of pegs for snuffer, pole, and chains. He closed the door behind him and let the world of cobbles, clattering hooves, and patrolling watchmen settle into silence once more. Here, in his private sanctuary, the day's labors lay stored for another dawn. For a moment, he simply stood, absorbing the calm and the glow. Outside, the street lamps continued their unbroken vigil, but here at home the dim radiance invited reflection. He exhaled, long and slow, acknowledging the completion of another round, dew and dousing, oil and repairs, fire and extinguishing. Each task had brought him here, to this stillness, where he could rest until the night's vigil was done and the new day stirred. Then, with careful hands, he removed his gloves and hung them beside his snuffer. He set the pole against the wall, tending the small lamp at his side until its flame no larger than a star leaned steady in its glass. Soon, he would rise, collect his tools, and step once more into the streets before dawn, to continue the timeless work of bearing light through darkness. But for now, he closed his eyes in gentle contentment, cradled by the light he had kindled and extinguished 100 times, and by the city that would sleep safe under his watch until morning's first beams. When at last he slips back through the low door of the lamp house, the echo of his final footfall fades into a calm silence. A single pane of pale moonlight rests on the worn threshold, and he pauses, shedding woolen cloak and gauntlet gloves by the entrance. The room smells faintly of whale oil and smoldering wick, a comforting fragrance that has become as familiar as hearth smoke in his own cottage. Here, in this quiet haven, the rituals of the night's work yield to personal care, and each motion brings him closer to rest after so many hours along dew-damp cobblestones. He stands a moment in stillness, letting the hush settle over tightened shoulders and walk-worn feet, allowing the day's fatigue to gather itself, unhurried, before he turns to his tools. On a broad, chipped workbench by the north wall, his oil flasks recline in a neat row, each glass vessel marked in soot with the number of lamps it served. With a soft rag, he begins to wipe residue from the curved bellies of the bottles, circling around the shoulder and base until the pale glass shines once more. Tiny beads of oil glimmer on the cloth as he works, memories of afternoon stops and hurried refills brushing his attention. He steps aside to a row of iron poles, his snuffer and lighting hooks, resting against wooden pegs. Each is traced with a fine coat of oil, and with measured strokes he rubs away the tacky film, revealing burnished steel that takes on the lamphouse's dim glow. Beside the poles, his folding ladder lies collapsed on the floor like a metallic skeleton. He lifts it gently, listening to the soft creak of oak and iron hinges. With deliberate care, he opens each joint, inspecting for chafe or warp. Loose screws are tightened by a small screwdriver drawn from his leather pouch, bits of splintered wood are smoothed with a file until no jagged edge remains to catch glove or cloth. As the ladder extends to its full height, he tests its weight, then taps each brace with a gloved hand, ensuring solidity. Thereafter, he hooks it upon the wall's stout beam, alongside the snuffer pole, their silhouettes forming the quiet tools of his nightly vigil. In the center of the lamp house, he sets a small stand upon the oaken table and places a solitary lamp upon it. Striking flint against steel, he draws a handful of sparks to ignite the wick, coaxing a gentle blue-tinged flame to life. The lamp's glow dances upon cracked plaster and reveals rows of lantern globes hanging overhead, some new, some marked by rainy nights and careless passing carts. He leaves the flame low, a single point of warmth in the dim room, and draws a narrow wooden stool to sit before it. The hush engulfs him like a velvet cloak, and he closes his eyes for a heartbeat, letting the lamp's soft hum cradle him after the clamor of the streets. At his side rests an inkpot and a stack of parchment, browned by age and rolled at the edges. He lifts a quill, its shaft worn smooth by many nights of writing, and dips it into the ink. For a few minutes the lamp flickers as words appear, a brief ledger of the night's work, notes on a bracket that bent at the docks, a count of missing or tone-dim lamps. He writes with slow deliberation, each stroke an invitation to calm. When the ledger is full, he turns to a fresh sheet and records his thoughts, quiet reflections upon the hush of sleeping alleys, the scattered shine of lanterns like fireflies, the ache in his bones that reminds him of each mile walked. This small ritual offers closure and order, turning a day of wandering through city shadows into something he can hold in hand. He then gathers scrapings of soot from a little tray, taps off the debris, and brushes his quill clean. The oil lamp before him casts long, wavering shadows that seem to pause in mid-air. He watches them drift across exposed timbers overhead before focusing once more on the task at hand. With an oiled cloth he cares for the lamp's glass chimney, wiping away fine dust and fingerprints until the barrier is translucent again. He checks the level of oil in its reservoir, topping it just enough to ensure a steady flame whenever he might require light one last time before sleep. Everything must remain ready. A lamp keeper's peace of mind depends on tools in prime condition. A final inspection of the room sees him replace each flask upon its hook, rowed in order of capacity. He secures lids tight to guard against any spill. His ladder and snuffer rest in their places like silent sentinels. The low stool is pushed beneath the table, its legs aligned with care. The hearth in the corner, cold now, holds only a few pitted coals buried under ash. There will be no more fire until tomorrow's first dawn. He steps back, observing the quiet tableau, tools and ledger, lamp and stool, lamp house at rest, and allows himself a moment of silent gratitude for the small sphere he shapes each night. Finally, he returns to the lamp, its wick judiciously trimmed short so that the flame will burn cleanly. He lays a taped parchment atop the bench to mark tomorrow's route, then reaches out and pinches the wick between thumb and forefinger. The lamp's small flare sighs as the flame surrenders to the dark. A single curl of smoke lingers before vanishing into the rafters. He closes his eyes against the sudden ebb of warmth and light, as if greeting the hush of sleep itself. With the snuffer, he caps a stubby beeswax candle upon the desk, its stub of wick no longer needed. The lamp house returns to absolute stillness, the quiet before all the world awakens to fresh dust and dew. He brushes soot from his hands, draws a final breath of oil-tinged air, and makes for the narrow bed alcove at the rear. In the dim recess, his straw mattress awaits beneath a threadbare blanket. He slips beneath its folds, stows the ledger on a low shelf, and stretches arms overhead, feeling the long curve of wooden beams above him. Lulled by the rhythm of his own breathing and secure in the knowledge that every lamp is righted, every tool at peace, he lets his eyes drift shut. In the hush of midnight reflections, the city's glow recedes into dream, and the lamplighter rests until dawn's pale promise stirs the world once more.